What the? Dude, hold.
It's great to have you back. Every year, people head into forests with a camera, hoping to capture wildlife or beautiful scenery. But every so often, they record something towering, human-like, and completely unexplained, lurking just beyond the trees. Join me as we break down the most horrifying Bigfoot encounters ever caught on camera and decide for yourself whether these chilling moments can really be explained. I'm a 36-year-old field biologist taking short-term assignments documenting wildlife in remote areas whenever conservation groups need extra help. Most jobs end with a report explaining why a bear, elk, or mountain lion was mistaken for something else. The survey area covered a little over 12 square miles of dense forest that had produced nearly a dozen reports over the previous 8 months. The reports came from experienced hikers, hunters, and a pair of forestry workers who had all described roughly the same thing despite never speaking to one another. That's usually a good sign that there's at least something worth investigating. Most assignments like this end with a perfectly reasonable explanation, but every now and then you get one that keeps refusing to fit neatly into a box. Before doing any hiking, I marked every reported sighting on my GPS and picked out the locations that made the most sense for trail cameras. By early afternoon, I'd set up 5 cameras along game trails, creek crossings, and one narrow ridgeline where several witnesses claimed the white animal had crossed. I found plenty of deer tracks, a few black bear prints, and enough elk signs to explain why so many predators passed through the area. Around sunset, I climbed onto a rocky overlook that gave me a clear view of a small meadow below. It was exactly the kind of place a large animal might cross before dark. I spent nearly an hour behind the camera without seeing anything unusual and was already thinking about heading back to camp when something caught my eye near the tree line. A large white figure stepped into the opening and continued walking across the meadow at an unhurried pace. It never stopped, never looked around, and disappeared into the trees on the opposite side less than 10 seconds later. The footage wasn't nearly clear enough to identify what I'd just recorded, but it definitely wasn't what I'd expected to find out there. Back at camp, I transferred the footage onto my laptop and zoomed in, frame by frame. The distance made it hard to pick out details, but one thing stood out immediately. The shoulders looked far too broad for a deer, and the way it moved didn't remind me of any bear I'd ever studied. It also didn't look like a person wearing white clothing, which ruled out the explanation I had been hoping for. I watched the clip several more times before comparing it with the witness reports I'd been given. Nearly all of them placed the sightings within a mile of where I'd been standing that evening. Whatever I'd filmed had followed the same route people had been describing for months. That was enough for me to extend the survey. I emailed the conservation group and told them I'd be extending the survey by a few days. At that point, all I expected to send back was better footage of an animal nobody had managed to identify yet. I reset my alarm for before sunrise, swapped out every battery I could, and planned to check the trail cameras first thing in the morning. The real work was just beginning. I left camp before sunrise and checked on the trail cameras. At 5:43 that morning, a large white figure entered the frame from the left and crossed the trail at a steady pace before disappearing into the trees less than 5 seconds later. It never paused or acknowledged the camera. The footage still wasn't clear enough to identify what I'd recorded, but it confirmed one important thing. Whatever this animal was, it had already passed through the survey area twice in less than 24 hours. That meant I finally had a pattern to work with. I spent the rest of the morning following the creek where the second camera had captured the white figure. The banks were soft enough to hold tracks, and before long, I found exactly what I'd been hoping for. I followed them upstream until the trees opened into a shallow crossing. That's where I saw it again. The white figure stepped into the water and crossed at an easy pace, giving me several uninterrupted seconds to film before disappearing into the timber on the opposite bank. I remember forcing myself not to adjust the zoom too much. One sudden movement was all it would take to lose the shot. Whatever I was filming never looked in my direction. It crossed the creek at an easy pace, climbed the opposite bank, and disappeared into the trees as quietly as it had arrived. I stood there for another minute, with the camera still pointed at the empty crossing, almost expecting it to come back. At the time, I thought that would end up being the most interesting footage I'd bring home. It wasn't even close. Back at camp, I started crossing possibilities off the list one by one. It wasn't a bear. The shoulders were too narrow, the legs were too long, and bears simply don't move with that kind of upright stride for more than a few steps. It wasn't a person either. The arms extended well below the waist, the body proportions were completely wrong, and no one wearing a costume could have crossed that rocky creek bed so effortlessly. Like everyone else, I'd heard the stories about Bigfoot over the years, but I never imagined I'd be sitting in my tent trying to explain an albino one. Albinism occurs in mammals, even if it's extremely rare, and there was no biological reason an undiscovered primate couldn't have the same condition. After ruling out every explanation that made sense, only one possibility fit what I was seeing. I was looking at an albino Bigfoot, and if I was right, it was one of the rarest animals anyone had ever recorded. Figuring out what it was felt like the biggest breakthrough of the trip. It turned out to be one of the least surprising things I would discover that week. I must have watched the footage 20 times before finally shutting the laptop. Every time I thought I'd found something that proved I was wrong, another detail pushed me back to the same conclusion. By the time I went to sleep, I wasn't trying to figure out what it was anymore. I was trying to figure out how to find it again. Knowing albinism can make animals more sensitive to bright sunlight gave me a place to start. If this thing shared even some of the same traits, it would probably spend more time under thick forest cover than out in the open. Instead of waiting near the meadow where I'd first seen it, I moved to a shaded creek crossing that stayed protected by the trees for most of the day. I also set up a small camouflage blind overlooking the area and switched to a longer lens so I could film from a distance without disturbing it. The waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Hours went by without so much as a squirrel wandering into frame, and I started wondering if I'd completely misread the area. Then, late that afternoon, movement caught my eye. The albino Bigfoot stepped out of the timber and walked straight through the crossing. I was thrilled with those recordings. If someone had told me I'd barely remember them by the end of the week, I never would have believed it. It never looked in my direction and seemed completely unaware I was there. I stayed in the blind for another hour hoping it'd come back, but it never did. Sitting inside that blind, I honestly felt like I'd finally figured it out. If the rest of the assignment went this smoothly, this might end up being a pretty good anniversary present for my wife after all. I backed up every clip onto a second memory card before turning in for the night. Losing a week's worth of footage because of a corrupted file would have been embarrassing enough. Losing what might have been the first convincing recording of an albino Bigfoot would have been even worse. I remember falling asleep thinking the hard part was finally behind me. After that, I stopped waiting for the albino Bigfoot to come to me and started following it instead. Every encounter lasted a little longer than the one before. It never ran, but it never stood still long enough for me to get close either. Whenever I thought I was about to lose sight of it, the white figure would appear again farther up the trail or between another stand of trees, almost as if it wanted to make sure I didn't turn around. More than once, I considered heading back to camp, but every new glimpse convinced me to keep going just a little farther. Looking back, that was probably the first mistake I made. At the time, though, it felt like progress. The longer I kept it in view, the better my chances of documenting behavior no one had ever recorded before. I had no reason to think I was doing exactly what the albino wanted. One encounter stood out more than all the others. I had stopped beside a fallen tree to steady my camera and crouched lower so I wouldn't lose sight of the albino through the brush. A few seconds later, it slowed down, turned slightly, and lowered itself into almost the same posture. I figured it was a coincidence until I started moving again. Instead of walking straight ahead, I stepped around the fallen trunk to get a better angle. The albino continued another few yards before circling around a different fallen tree in almost the same way. It wasn't copying me exactly, but the similarities were hard to ignore. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince myself I was reading too much into it. Animals often mirror each other's behavior without any deeper meaning. Still, that explanation became harder to believe every time I replayed the footage. Something about the way it reacted felt less instinctive and far more deliberate. I remember sitting on a fallen log before heading back to camp and replaying that clip over and over. I'd spent years studying animal behavior, and I knew how easy it was to mistake coincidence for intelligence. The problem was that the more I watched, the harder it became to convince myself that was all I'd seen. The next morning, I made my usual rounds to check the trail cameras. Most of them had captured the same wildlife they'd been recording all week, but one clip immediately caught my attention. The albino Bigfoot walked into frame carrying a thick dead branch nearly twice its height. It wasn't dragging it behind or using it to clear a path. It carried the branch with both hands, crossed the trail, and disappeared into the trees without stopping. I replayed the clip several times, trying to figure out what I'd just watched. Large primates have been known to use branches as tools or even carry nesting material, so I didn't think much of it at first. I simply assumed I'd recorded another behavior that hadn't been documented before. I marked the exact time, camera number, and location in my notebook. If it happened again, I wanted to know whether there was a pattern. I copied the footage onto my laptop, replaced the camera's batteries, and headed back into the forest, still wondering where it had taken that branch. Later that afternoon, I found the albino again near the edge of a small clearing. I stayed well back and filmed through the trees, hoping to avoid pushing my luck. It seemed to tolerate my presence for a few minutes, but the moment I took a few careful steps closer, everything changed. The forest suddenly went quiet. Even the birds that had been calling all afternoon stopped at once. I remember thinking the silence felt wrong. Then the albino stopped walking, bent down, and grabbed a thick dead limb lying on the forest floor. In one motion, it swung the branch into the trunk of a nearby tree with enough force to split it clean in two. The crack echoed through the forest. It didn't charge or run. It simply stood there, watching me. Every instinct I had told me I'd crossed a line I wasn't supposed to cross. I kept the camera rolling for another few seconds, slowly backed away without taking my eyes off it, and didn't stop until there were several hundred yards between us. It was the first time since arriving that I felt less like I was documenting wildlife, and more like I'd just been warned. I honestly thought that would end up being the most intimidating thing I captured. But it wasn't. I seriously considered ending the assignment right there. I even started packing a few things around camp before talking myself out of it. The scientist in me kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation for what I'd witnessed. Curiosity won, and by the next morning, I was back out checking cameras again. The warning stayed in the back of my mind for the rest of the day, so I decided to check the trail cameras before heading back to camp. Most of them were uneventful, but one clip made me stop. The albino Bigfoot walked into frame carrying a heavy log across its shoulder before disappearing into the trees again. That raised a question I couldn't answer. Why was it carrying logs? It wasn't building a nest. It wasn't eating. It wasn't clearing a trail either. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping I'd missed something, but the clip ended before it reached its destination. Combined with the branch I'd seen the day before, it no longer felt like an isolated behavior. Whatever it was doing, it seemed deliberate. I just couldn't figure out the purpose yet. At the time, I assumed I was documenting. Another unusual behavior. I had no idea those few seconds of trail camera footage would eventually become some of the most important evidence from the entire expedition. My plan stopped working almost overnight. The shaded creek crossing that had produced my most promising footage stayed completely empty, and none of the trails I'd been following showed any fresh sign of the albino. I moved between every camera hoping it had simply changed its route, but they all came back with the same result. Nothing. That made me wonder if I'd gotten lucky, or if the albino had noticed the pattern before I did. Either way, I couldn't keep waiting in the same place anymore. If I wanted more footage, I'd have to start looking for it again instead of expecting it to come to me. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving cameras to new game trails and swapping memory cards. If the albino had changed its routine, I'd have to change mine too. Part of me wondered if I was giving the animal too much credit. Maybe I'd simply been lucky during those first few days, and now I was chasing patterns that didn't really exist. It wouldn't be the first time a field assignment had humbled me. I found it again the following afternoon, but this encounter only left me with more questions. The albino wasn't alone long enough for me to film anything unusual, but one of the trail cameras I collected that evening filled in the missing piece. It showed the albino walking through with several large rocks cradled against its chest before disappearing off the edge of the frame. Now I'd recorded it, logs and rocks, on 3 separate occasions. That wasn't something animals normally did without a reason. For a second, I actually wondered if it was building me a bench so we could sit down, share a drink, and talk about life. As ridiculous as that sounded, I couldn't come up with a better explanation. Whatever it was making, it clearly wasn't finished yet. Over the next 2 days, I kept seeing the same thing. Every time I checked a trail camera, the albino seemed to be carrying something different. One clip showed another heavy branch. Another captured it dragging a smaller log across the forest floor. A third ended just as it disappeared behind the trees with what looked like a pile of loose rocks. None of the cameras ever showed where it was taking any of it. They always stopped recording first. One clip showed it dragging another heavy log uphill with both hands before disappearing behind a stand of fir trees. Another captured it carrying several smaller branches tucked beneath one arm while balancing what looked like a flat rock in the other. Just like every recording before it, the footage ended a few seconds too early. I even hiked in the direction it had gone a few times, expecting to find some kind of shelter or nesting site, but there was nothing there. I even compared the timestamps from each camera, hoping they'd point to the same general area. Instead, they only confirmed that the albino was covering an incredible amount of ground between recordings. However it was moving through the forest, it knew the terrain far better than I ever could. By the fifth day, I finally caught another break. Fresh tracks led away from one of the creek crossings, and this time they hadn't been washed out overnight. I followed them carefully until I spotted the albino moving through the trees less than 50 yards ahead. It was the closest I'd ever been. I raised the camera and stayed exactly where I was, hoping not to repeat the mistake I'd made a few days earlier. I expected it to disappear the moment it noticed me. Instead, it glanced in my direction and kept walking at exactly the same pace. Not faster, not slower, almost as if it had already decided how close it was willing to let me get. Instead of disappearing into the forest like it usually did, the albino took a few slow steps to the side and waited. Once I started moving again, it did the same, always staying just far enough ahead to remain in sight. I should have turned around right then. Instead, I convinced myself I was finally documenting behavior nobody had ever recorded before. So I followed, careful to keep my distance, while the albino quietly led the way. Looking back, that's probably the moment the assignment stopped being mine. I thought I was deciding where to go next because I still had the camera in my hands. The reality was a lot less comforting. Every decision I made after that was based on wherever the albino wanted me to look. I didn't make it much farther before I noticed something else was wrong. I pulled out my GPS to mark the latest sighting and immediately realized I was several miles from camp. I'd been so focused on keeping the albino in view that I hadn't paid much attention to where it had been taking me. The quickest way back meant retracing my steps, so I turned around and started hiking in that direction. I hadn't gone more than 10 minutes when I froze. Standing on the trail ahead was the albino. It wasn't making any threatening movements. It simply stood there, watching me. I waited for it to leave, but it didn't. After a few minutes, I decided to take a different route instead. At the time, I told myself it was just another coincidence. Looking back, I don't think it was trying to stop me. I think it was waiting to see whether I'd choose the path it wanted. The alternate route lasted less than an hour. Just as I reached another narrow game trail, the albino stepped out from behind a cluster of cedars and stopped again. Different trail, same result. That's when I stopped believing it was coincidence. It wasn't following me from a distance, and it wasn't wandering through the forest at random. Somehow, it kept appearing exactly where I intended to go next. I backed away without taking my eyes off it and looked for a third route instead. The farther I walked, the quieter the forest seemed to become. Even the birds had gone silent. I told myself I was overthinking it, but one question kept coming back. If the albino already knew where I was going, where exactly was it trying to keep me from reaching? I spent the next half hour trying to work around it, but every route I picked seemed to funnel me back toward the same section of forest. The albino didn't appear every time, but it appeared often enough that I finally stopped pretending there wasn't a pattern. Then another trail camera gave me something else to think about. Earlier that afternoon, before I packed it away, it had recorded the albino dragging another long log in exactly the same direction as the others. It wasn't wandering while carrying those branches, rocks, and logs. It had a destination. Standing there with the camera in one hand and my GPS in the other, I couldn't shake a question that suddenly felt a lot more important than what the albino was building. Why was it spending so much time preparing one specific part of the forest? I stopped walking and listened. The forest had gone quiet again. No birds, no squirrels moving through the brush, just the wind pushing through the trees. I'd spent enough years working outdoors to know that kind of silence usually meant something nearby had every other animal on edge. Whether it was a mountain lion, a bear, or the albino, I wasn't interested in finding out which one. That was my cue to stop pretending this was just another survey. As much as I wanted to finish the assignment, I had a wife waiting at home and an anniversary I'd rather not miss. I also wasn't too excited about becoming the guy whose obituary read, "Contracted field biologist, killed while chasing a giant white ape through the woods." Search and rescue confirmed they had my location and told me to stay exactly where I was while they sent a helicopter. At that point, whatever happened to the albino after that could be someone else's job. I found a small clearing and settled in to wait. There wasn't much else I could do until the helicopter arrived. After a few minutes, I started looking around more carefully, mostly to keep myself occupied. That's when I noticed something that hadn't registered before. Several fallen logs had been dragged into places that felt odd. A few large rocks were stacked along one side of the clearing, while thick branches filled gaps between clusters of trees. None of it looked unnatural on its own, but together it seemed strangely organized. I walked a slow circle around the area, and the more I looked, the less random it felt. There was really only one easy way in and one easy way out. Every other direction was cluttered with logs, brush, or rocks that forced you back toward the same narrow opening. Then I remembered every trail camera clip I'd collected over the last few days. The branches, the logs, the rocks. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what the albino had been carrying and started wondering where it had wanted me to end up. I walked the perimeter one more time, hoping I'd notice something that proved I was overreacting. I didn't. If anything, every step made the layout feel more intentional than the last. I backed up a few steps and looked at the clearing again, this time as if I were seeing it for the first time. The layout suddenly made sense. The logs hadn't fallen there naturally, the rocks weren't scattered at random, and the branches weren't just piled together. They had narrowed the area until there was only a single opening wide enough to move through comfortably. If someone, or something, walked into the clearing from the wrong direction, every other path forced them back toward that same gap. It wasn't a cage. I could still climb over the logs or push through the brush if I had to. It would just take time, more time than anyone would want if something was standing between them and the only easy way out. Then another thought hit me. Every encounter over the past few days had pulled me farther from camp and closer to this exact part of the forest. The albino hadn't been wandering. It had been leading me here. The branches, the logs, and the rocks suddenly meant something very different, piece by piece, day after day, right in front of my cameras, and I'd spent almost a week asking the wrong question. It had been building this, so much for sharing a drink and talking about life. Whatever the albino had been building, it definitely wasn't a bench. I stayed exactly where search and rescue had told me to, but the albino didn't leave. Every few minutes, I'd catch another glimpse of white moving between the trees before it disappeared again. It never came any closer, but it never wandered far either. The longer I watched, the more it felt like it was waiting for me to make the first move. Every instinct told me to stay put. If I walked back into the trees, I'd be doing exactly what it had spent the last several days trying to get me to do. So I kept the camera rolling and waited. For the first time since this assignment began, I wasn't trying to find the albino anymore. I was hoping the helicopter would find me first. Those next several minutes felt longer than the previous 5 days combined. Every rustle in the trees made me glance up from the camera, expecting the albino to step into the clearing again. Eventually, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. At first, it was just a faint thumping somewhere beyond the mountains, but it grew louder with every passing second. The rescue helicopter circled once before spotting the clearing and lowering a rescue line. Relief hit me almost immediately. I clipped into the harness, kept my camera in one hand, and gave the crew a thumbs up. As I started rising above the trees, I instinctively pointed the camera back toward the clearing. If the albino was still nearby, this would be my last chance to film it. I had no idea those next few seconds would produce the clearest and easily the most disturbing footage of the entire assignment. The helicopter had barely settled into position when the albino finally stepped out from the trees. It wasn't looking at me anymore. Its attention was fixed entirely on the aircraft overhead. The constant noise immediately changed its behavior. It began pacing along the edge of the clearing, snapping branches beneath its feet and glancing up every few seconds. Then the searchlight swept across the trees and caught it in full view. The moment the beam reached the albino, it flinched, turned its head away from the light, and retreated several steps beneath the canopy. A few moments later, it cautiously stepped back into the clearing, only to retreat again as the spotlight passed over it. Watching the footage later, that was the first time I'd ever seen the albino lose its composure. For the first time since I arrived, the albino wasn't the one controlling what happened next. As the helicopter lifted me above the treetops, I kept the camera pointed toward the clearing below. From the ground, everything had looked like a mess of fallen timber and scattered rocks. From the air, it looked completely different. The logs, branches, and rock piles formed a narrow funnel that led into the exact spot where I'd been waiting. From above, I could even make out the alternate routes I'd tried taking earlier. They all narrowed into the same opening, blocked by the very logs and rock piles I'd spent days watching the albino carry through the forest. Every trail camera clip I'd collected over the past few days suddenly made sense. The albino hadn't been carrying those materials at random. It had been shaping the landscape one piece at a time. Then it stepped into the opening and looked up at the helicopter. The spotlight caught it again, forcing it back toward the trees, but before disappearing beneath the canopy, it stopped beside the entrance to the funnel and looked back one last time. That was the final piece I needed. It wasn't guarding a nest. It wasn't protecting a food source. It had stayed there because whatever it had built was finally finished. Looking down from the helicopter, I realized I hadn't been documenting the albino's behavior. I'd been documenting my own path into the trap it had spent days preparing for me. I did make it home in time for our anniversary, and my wife was right about one thing. I definitely came back with a story. I never accepted another assignment in that part of the forest, and I don't think I ever will. The first hiker was Mark Devlin, a former Marine, cocky as they come, the kind of guy who laughed at trail warnings taped to the ranger station door. He was alone, boots off, wading through the shallows of a river that cuts through 11 miles of dense timber where 3 other hikers had already gone missing that season. Missing under circumstances everyone now understands were caused by Bigfoot. The trail cam I'm looking at is bolted to a pine about 40 yards upstream, angled low across the water. You can see Mark splashing around, laughing to himself, completely unaware that Bigfoot is already in the river with him. That's the part that gets me every time I run this footage back. Bigfoot isn't approaching. Bigfoot is already there, submerged, patient, waiting in water that should be too cold and too shallow for anything that size to hide in. The water behind Mark rises, and it isn't a wave. It's a shape, darker than the riverbed, wider than any black bear that's ever been logged in this state, a hump of matted fur breaking the surface tension like a boulder learning to swim. Bigfoot doesn't roar. Bigfoot doesn't charge. It simply reaches up from beneath the current and closes a hand the size of a dinner plate around Mark's ankle. He goes under like a dropped stone. 3 seconds of thrashing, a burst of white foam, one hand clawing at the air, and then the river swallows the whole scene. The water goes still so fast, it's like the incident never happened, like Bigfoot wiped the record clean the second it was finished. The evidence they found afterward is what convinced even the skeptics on the search team. Mark's backpack, shredded clean through the nylon straps, was hanging from a low branch 20 feet upstream. 20 feet upstream against the current, which means Bigfoot carried it there before doubling back for the body. Inside the bag, his wallet sat untouched, cash still folded, ID still tucked in its sleeve. His phone was still recording audio from inside a side pocket. On that audio, underneath the gurgle of moving water, there's a wet, splintering crack that the coroner later matched to a femur fracture. A bone snapped the way you'd snap a breadstick, mid-limb, no hesitation. The most chilling detail wasn't the sound. It was the drag marks on the far bank, gouged 4 inches deep into wet clay, dragging in a straight line for nearly 60 yards before stopping dead at a sheer rock face. No footprints continuing past that point. No body recovered, then or ever. Just a wide smear where a slab of moss had been torn away in one violent motion, as if Bigfoot had gone vertical, scaling stone with a full-grown man clenched somewhere against its body and simply climbed out of the search radius entirely. I went back through 11 minutes of footage before that attack, hoping to find some earlier sign of Bigfoot in the frame, some warning the trail cam caught that Mark never saw. There isn't one. No ripple, no shadow crossing the far bank, nothing. Whatever Bigfoot is, it can hold itself completely motionless in cold current for the better part of an hour without disturbing a single reed on the bank, and that kind of discipline doesn't belong to an animal reacting to hunger. That belongs to something running a strategy. Divers went into that river 2 days later looking for Mark's remains and came up with nothing but a single boot. still laced, wedged 8 feet down between 2 boulders that hadn't shifted position in decades, according to the old survey maps. The boot had puncture marks through the leather, 4 of them, spaced in a pattern that matched nothing on record for any North American predator. Bigfoot had bitten straight through hardened hiking leather like it was cardboard, and it had done it while still holding a grown man underwater with the other hand. I thought that was the whole story. I thought, okay, a freak territorial attack, an animal defending a stretch of river. But that theory died 3 hours later when the second trail cam lit up, because it proved Bigfoot wasn't defending anything at all. Bigfoot was collecting. You ever see a woman get pulled through the wall of her own tent, like she's nothing but a fish being yanked through a hole in the ice? Well, that's exactly what happened next, and it's worse than the river. The second hiker was Sarah Blumhouse, a solo backpacker who had hiked the Appalachian Trail twice and genuinely believed she'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at a person. She had never accounted for Bigfoot. Her trail cam was a small motion-activated unit clipped inside her tent, angled toward the door flap, a setup meant to catch raccoons rifling through her food bag, not meant to catch Bigfoot reaching in from the outside world to take her. The timestamp reads 9:02 p.m. Sarah is zipped into her sleeping bag, reading by headlamp, murmuring to herself the way solo campers do to keep the silence from feeling so total. Then the nylon wall directly behind her doesn't tear. It peels, smooth and deliberate, the way you'd peel back the skin of a banana, which tells you Bigfoot has done this before, that this is technique and not blind rage. A hand slides through the gap, black, knuckled, knobbed at the joints, tipped with claws like chipped obsidian, and it wraps around her entire torso in one motion. Bigfoot extracts her through that slit without so much as loosening a single tent stake outside. She doesn't get a scream out. One frame she's sitting up reading. The next she's being hauled backward through the wall into freezing dark, her headlamp beam whipping wild arcs across the canvas as she disappears from view. The footprints outside measured 17 inches long and sank nearly 4 inches into packed dirt deep as fresh grave soil. But the footprints weren't even the piece of evidence that broke the case wide open. It was the sleeping bag. When the search party reached the site the next morning, the bag was still lying inside the collapsed tent, except it had been folded neatly, corners squared off, zipper drawn halfway shut, arranged with a strange, almost domestic precision, as if Bigfoot had paused mid-abduction to tidy the scene before vanishing into the tree line with a living person under its arm. Inside that fold, investigators found a single tuft of Sarah's hair, torn out by the root, and a smear of thick saliva that the lab flagged as belonging to no cataloged primate on record. A protein structure that didn't match bear, didn't match wolf, didn't match anything with a name. That's the moment the Forest Service tried to spin this as a bear attack for the press release. But bears don't fold camping gear. Bears don't extract a full-grown adult through a 6-inch gap without leaving a single drop of blood behind. Bigfoot does. There's a second angle on this attack that most people miss the first time through because it's easy to fixate on the tent wall peeling open. About 4 seconds before that peel starts, the trail cam picks up a low vibration in the audio track, a bass rumble that the sound techs later identified as footsteps, Bigfoot's footsteps, landing with such mass that the ground itself was carrying the sound before the creature ever made contact with the canvas. Sarah never reacts to it. She keeps reading. Whatever frequency Bigfoot moves at, it's below what a human ear registers as a threat, which means every one of these 6 hikers had less warning than a single heartbeat before Bigfoot was already on top of them. Search dogs brought to the site the next day refused to cross the tree line past the folded sleeping bag. Every handler on scene described the same reaction, the dogs planting their feet, backing up, refusing food and commands both, as if the scent trail leading into the dark carried something their training had never prepared them to walk toward. One dog broke its leash entirely and bolted back to the trailhead, and it took 3 hours to recover it 2 miles down the mountain, still trembling, still refusing to go near the tree line where Bigfoot had vanished with Sarah under its arm. You want to know what actually keeps me up at night reviewing this footage? The math. 2 hikers taken in under 12 hours on the same ridge by the same creature, and neither scene showed signs of feeding. Bigfoot wasn't eating, Bigfoot was stockpiling, and stockpiling means there was a plan. And if you think a silent ambush through canvas is the worst this thing does, wait until you see what happens when a hiker actually tries to fight back. Fair warning, he becomes the weapon. The hiker was Alex Brennan, young, athletic, armed with bear spray and a flare gun, absolutely convinced that gear alone would be enough to handle whatever the ridge threw at him. His trail cam sat on a tripod near his fire pit, angled to catch his morning routine for a vlog he never got to finish. Timestamp 5:44 a.m. First light barely breaking over the ridge. He's cooking breakfast, laughing at his own jokes about the 17-inch tracks he found the day before, completely unaware that Bigfoot had circled back overnight and was already inside the tree line, 20 feet from where he was standing. This trail cam has captured much more of Bigfoot than I have time to show you in this video. That's why, if you click the link in the description, you can read about everything I have truly found. But I have to warn you, you will never think of Bigfoot the same ever again after reading my findings. Back to Alex now. Bigfoot comes out of that tree line at a full sprint, not a lumbering charge. A sprint, low and fast, closing the 20-foot gap in under 2 seconds. Easily 9 feet at full height, its shoulders wider than the fire pit itself, its fur a matted, rust-dark red that the footage catches rippling with the impact of each stride. Alex sees it first and swings the only weapon within reach, a cast-iron frying pan, directly at its skull. Bigfoot doesn't flinch. It backhands him mid-swing with enough force to send him sideways into a pine trunk so hard the trunk splinters at chest height, bark exploding outward in a spray of white wood chips. Alex tries to crawl. Bigfoot closes the distance in a single stride, grabs him by the left leg, and lifts him fully upside down. A grown man, dangling one-handed off the ground like a rag doll. Then Bigfoot swings him, full arm, into a nearby boulder. The impact registers on the audio as a single dense crunch, and Alex goes limp mid-swing. Bigfoot isn't done. It grabs his collar with the other hand and drags him toward the brush the way a person drags a duffel bag, one fist on the ankle, one fist on the jacket, his body bouncing over rocks and roots the entire way. The evidence at that site told its own story before the search team even opened the file. Beyond the shattered pine, Alex's hiking pole was found driven vertically into the dirt, his cap balanced on top like a small, gruesome flag marking the spot. But the detail that actually stopped the coroner cold was a single tooth, 3 inches long, serrated along one edge, embedded so deep in the split pine bark that it had to be chiseled free. It wasn't a canine. Lab analysis called it a molar. A molar belonging to something that chews before it drags, and wedged in the roots of that molar was a strip of human skin. Bigfoot bites its victims before it ever bothers hauling them off. What most people miss on the first watch is the 11 seconds before Bigfoot ever breaks the tree line. The trail cam catches the branches at the edge of frame, swaying against the wind pattern, moving opposite the direction every other bough on that slope was leaning that morning. Bigfoot was already pacing the perimeter of Alex's camp, long before the frying pan ever came out. Circling, sizing up the terrain, choosing an angle of attack that put the pine trunk directly in Alex's escape path. That's not a startled animal defending territory. That's a hunt with a plan built in before the first move was made. The frying pan itself turned up 9 feet from the fire pit, folded almost in half along its own handle. The cast iron cracked clean through in a spot that should be structurally impossible to break with a bare hand. Rangers who examined it said the fracture pattern matched a force closer to a hydraulic press than any bite or swing, which tells you Bigfoot didn't need momentum to do that kind of damage. It did it standing still, almost as an afterthought, on the way to grabbing Alex by the leg. You think one solo male victim proves a pattern? Day 2 hadn't even started yet, and Bigfoot was already getting creative, because this thing doesn't just grab prey. It plays with it first. The hiker was Jenna Morales, an experienced climber who set her trail cam to watch her own back while she rappelled 70 feet down a sheer granite face, a habit she'd picked up after a rockslide scare the year before. Timestamp 11:22 a.m. She's halfway down the wall, methodically checking her knots, sunlight hitting the rock in sharp white bands, when a shadow the size of a delivery truck blots out the sun directly above her. And that shadow is Bigfoot. Bigfoot doesn't climb down to reach her. It jumps, clearing 30 feet of open rock face in one leap, landing against the vertical granite with claws that punch straight into stone like ice axes. It clings there, spider-like, impossibly balanced on a wall that shouldn't hold a creature that size, and reaches down with one arm to cover Jenna's entire face with a single palm. Her legs kick against open air for a solid 30 seconds. You can count the kicks on the footage, 30 full seconds of a person fighting for her life against a hand that never once loses its grip, and then she goes still. Bigfoot unhooks her carabiner one-handed, slings her limp body over its shoulder, and climbs back up that same vertical face using only its legs and feet, gripping the stone like gecko pads while it carries a full-grown adult the rest of the way up without slowing. At the base of the cliff, searchers found Jenna's water bottle crushed flat. The aluminum spiraled like it had been wrung out by hand. But the piece of evidence that made the front page was her jacket, snagged on a rock horn at the very top of the climb. Inside the pocket, her phone had kept recording the entire time. The final frame on that video isn't the cliff face or the canopy below. It's Bigfoot's face, filling the entire lens from an inch away, inspecting the device with two flat yellow irises and no visible pupils, its breath fogging the glass with a cold that shouldn't exist in July. Jenna was never found. The only trace left behind was a single fingernail, hers, cracked and lodged into a crevice at the summit, as if she'd clawed at the bare stone with everything she had left, while Bigfoot carried her off into the canopy without breaking stride. The climbing partner, who was supposed to be waiting at the base, never saw Bigfoot at all. His statement to the rangers said he heard exactly one sound, a low creak like a tree bending under sudden weight, followed by total silence, followed by Jenna's rope going slack and coiling into the dirt with no one attached to the far end. He looked up in time to see nothing but drifting rock dust where Bigfoot had launched off the wall, and by the time he processed what he'd witnessed, the canopy had already closed over the escape route like it had never been disturbed. Rangers rappelled that same face 2 days later to recover gear and found something they hadn't expected. 3 more sets of the same 17-inch prints pressed into a narrow ledge 60 feet up, a ledge with no trail access, no reasonable climbing route, nothing but sheer granite on every side. Bigfoot had been using that ledge as a waypoint, a resting shelf between the valley floor and whatever den it was hauling victims back to, which meant this stretch of cliff wasn't a hunting ground Bigfoot stumbled into. It was a route Bigfoot had already mapped out and used before. That closed out day 1. Day 2 is when Bigfoot got provoked, because now somebody was shooting back at it. Our next hiker was Juan Peñaflor, a lifelong hunter who'd heard the screams echoing off the ridge the night before and made the decision to set up a defensive blind with a high-caliber rifle, fully expecting whatever came out of the fog to go down in one shot. His trail cam faced his own firing position, timestamp 2:15 p.m. Through drifting fog, Bigfoot appears at the tree line, walking slow, upright, deliberate, arms swinging with a weight that makes the branches around it visibly shudder. Juan fires first, a direct center mass hit. Bigfoot doesn't even stagger. The fur along its chest ripples with the impact, and a thick, tar-black substance seeps out where the round entered, but the stride doesn't break. He fires again, then again, working the bolt as fast as his hands allow, emptying the entire magazine into Bigfoot's face and chest at close range. Bigfoot blinks once. That's the entire visible reaction to 6 rounds of high-caliber ammunition. It reaches into the blind, wraps one fist around the rifle barrel, and bends the entire weapon into a tight U-shape with a single flex of its wrist, the same way a person might bend a green twig. Then it takes Juan by the throat, lifts him clean off the ground to eye level, and squeezes. He doesn't struggle for long. The audio catches a series of dense popping cracks as his vertebrae give way one at a time, like someone snapping bubble. Wrap in sequence. The evidence that followed was the most significant find of the entire 2-day period. A blood trail, not Juan's, but Bigfoot's own, dripping from the graze wound where one of those 6 rounds had actually broken skin along its shoulder. Search teams followed that trail for 1.5 miles, straight to a massive granite boulder that had been physically rolled away from a crevice cut into the hillside. A boulder that weighed, by later estimate, somewhere north of 2,000 pounds, moved like it was nothing. Inside that crevice they found bones, dozens of them, deer, black bear, and, confirmed by forensic anthropology, human femurs, stacked deliberately like cordwood along the crevice wall. No skulls anywhere in the pile. Not a single cranium was found among the scattered remains, despite the search team documenting bones from nearly every other part of the human body. Bigfoot keeps the head somewhere else, a detail nobody on the search team has been able to explain, and one that completely changes the way investigators interpret what was actually happening out on that ridge. Whatever purpose the separate placement served, it appeared deliberate rather than accidental, suggesting that the bodies were being handled according to some consistent pattern instead of simply discarded. The blood trail ended right right at the crevice mouth, sealed shut again with a fresh smear of black ichor across the narrow seam where the massive boulder had been rolled back into place. Investigators noted that the entrance showed fresh disturbance compared to the surrounding rock, as though it had been opened only hours earlier before being concealed again. It was a den, it was full, and it belonged to Bigfoot. Ballistics later confirmed all 6 rounds Juan fired connected, 3 to the chest, 2 to the shoulder, 1 grazing the jawline, a spread that would drop a full-grown grizzly bear in seconds. Bigfoot absorbed every one of them and kept walking at the same unbroken pace, which tells you whatever is under that fur isn't built like anything cataloged in a biology textbook. The Forestry Service's own ballistics consultant refused to sign off on a final report, citing, in his own words on record, that the wound pattern was inconsistent with mammalian physiology, and then declined to elaborate further. Inside that crevice den, alongside the stacked femurs, searchers also recovered scraps of fabric from at least 4 different jackets, none of which matched any of the 6 known hikers, meaning Bigfoot's collection predates this 2-day span by a significant margin, and meaning this ridge has been a hunting ground far longer than anyone on the search team wants to admit publicly. One of those jacket scraps still had a zipper pull stamped with a manufacturer's date code that put its original sale nearly 6 years in the past, a detail that made it into an internal memo but never into any public statement. Because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that Bigfoot had been operating on this exact mountain, undetected, for the better part of a decade before a single trail cam ever caught a frame of it. A forestry biologist who cataloged the crevice contents privately estimated the bone stack represented more than a decade of activity, all of it credited to Bigfoot, all of it kept sealed behind 2,000 pounds of granite until Juan's rifle rounds forced Bigfoot to finally reveal where it had been storing the evidence of every hiker the mountain had quietly lost. That crevice wasn't the end of the count. It was the moment the count stopped being sick. You want to know what Bigfoot actually does with them once they're taken? The forestry scientists floated theories for months after the earlier disappearances. Some believed the victims were being hidden and saved for later feeding. Others suggested some kind of hibernation cache where bodies were stored in remote mountain shelters until winter. A few researchers even argued the behavior resembled ritualistic caching seen in certain intelligent animals, though nobody could explain why. Every theory sounded unbelievable, yet every one of them was considered because there simply wasn't a better explanation. Then the 6th trail cam answered every single question at once, and I promise you, you will wish it hadn't. Instead of solving one mystery, it opened several more that investigators spent years trying to explain, and it still wasn't the last file the Iowa Forest Service had to open that week. This is the one the Forest Service tried hardest to keep out of the public file. Even among investigators who had already reviewed the previous recordings, this was the footage that several reportedly refused to watch a second time. The hiker was Min Park, hiking solo, and he had the foresight, or the bad luck, to set up a trail cam facing directly into his own tent from about 10 feet away. He wanted to capture any wildlife wandering through camp overnight while also documenting his trip for himself. The camera had a clear, unobstructed view of the tent entrance and enough infrared illumination to record almost every movement after dark. He was inside, reading by headlamp, occasionally shifting in his sleeping bag as the forest remained completely still around him, when Bigfoot came crashing out of the underbrush. Every previous attack on this footage had been quiet, controlled, almost surgical. The creature had moved with deliberate patience, avoiding unnecessary noise until the exact moment it struck. This one wasn't. Bigfoot came in screaming, a deep, guttural infrasonic wail that cracks the trail cam's microphone and distorts the entire audio track into harsh static for nearly half a second before the recording finally clears. Even after the sound stabilizes, the microphone continues clipping from the sheer volume of the vocalization as the creature barrels straight toward the tent without slowing down. Min bolts upright and out of the tent flap holding a hatchet, the only weapon he'd brought. He swings hard, aiming for the head. Bigfoot catches his forearm mid-swing and with a single twist of its wrist rips the entire arm off at the shoulder. Not a tear, a full separation. The same motion you'd use pulling a drumstick off a roasted chicken. Min drops screaming, blood spraying in a wide arc across the tent canvas. Bigfoot doesn't lift him this time. It drops to all fours over his body, pins him flat against the dirt with one enormous forearm, and goes to work. I've run this footage more than 40 times trying to catalog every second of it, and it never gets easier to watch. Bigfoot doesn't kill him quickly. It bites down into his torso and shakes him the way a dog shakes a rag doll, crushes his pelvis flat with a single downward stomp, and then, while Min is still twitching, still alive by every visible measure, it uses its claws to open his abdomen and draw out his intestines, wrapping the length of them around one closed fist like a plate of spaghetti. Min stops moving roughly 90 seconds into the attack. Bigfoot keeps working for another 4 full minutes, pulverizing bone with its own weight, scattering torn tissue in a wide radius around the collapsed tent, before finally scooping the remains into a single bundle, tucking it under one arm, and walking calmly back into the tree line like the entire event had cost it nothing. The evidence recovered at that campsite told the whole grim story on its own. The hatchet was found bent completely in half. Kevin's headlamp was still switched on, lens coated in a pale gray paste the lab confirmed as brain matter. His left hand, severed clean at the wrist, was still locked around a thick tuft of Bigfoot's own fur, ripped free during the struggle. The single clearest DNA sample recovered from the entire 2-day span. But the piece of evidence that ended every internal debate at the Forest Service was the trail cam itself. It had been knocked flat, its lens cracked down the middle, but it kept recording audio for 2 full minutes after the picture went dark. 2 minutes of wet, rhythmic crunching before the stomping finally resumes and fades off into the trees. That crunching is what sent search teams back to Juan's crevice within the week, and this time there was nothing to find. 2,000 pounds of granite gone, rolled off to some new position the ground-penetrating radar couldn't map. Bigfoot had already relocated the den before anyone thought to check it twice. The bone stack, picked clean, was gone with it, but the dogs at Min's site weren't done working. 12 feet from the collapsed tent, under 6 inches of disturbed soil, one of them turned up a second set of remains. And this set wasn't new. Those remains were badly weathered, partial, and matched through dental records to a hiker who'd been logged as missing more than 4 years earlier, long before this 2-day span ever began. The bone damage on that older set was identical to Min's. Same crush pattern on the pelvis, same twisting fracture at the shoulder joint where a limb had been separated whole. That makes 7 confirmed matches to the same set of jaws, not 6, and the forestry biologist cataloging the crevice never got to finish her count. 2 days after she filed her preliminary notes, a second trail cam, one she'd staked half a mile east on her own time, at the mouth of a crevice she hadn't even logged with the department yet, caught movement, upright, 17 inches to a stride, moving away from her position, not toward it, which her field notes flagged as the only mercy in the entire case file. Bigfoot didn't discover this ridge 2 days before Mark waded into that river. Bigfoot has been working this exact stretch of mountain for years, quietly, methodically, long before a single trail cam was ever mounted to catch it in the act. And the count keeps moving. Every fresh set of prints logged since Min's site has walked a slightly different line than the last, never repeating a den once it's been found, never circling back to ground that's already been searched. Somewhere on that ridge right now, there's a 7th trail cam nobody has pulled footage from yet, strapped to a tree by a hiker who has no idea that something already knows exactly where that camera is mounted and exactly when the battery light stops blinking red. 6 families are still waiting on remains that were never recovered, and a 7th family, older, quieter, filed as closed 4 years before anyone thought to reopen it, is only now learning their hiker belongs on this same list. The Forest Service hasn't released the location of that second unlogged crevice. The biologist who found it hasn't been back to check it, and every ranger working that district will tell you off the record that the mountain isn't finished because the prints keep moving. The dens keep emptying out ahead of every search party that finds them, and somewhere past the last known ridge line, there's a trail cam still rolling, patiently waiting to catch whoever walks past it next. My name is Sebastian, and I saw Bigfoot while abroad in Europe. I recorded him clear as day, but that was only the beginning. By sunset, I had found evidence that Bigfoot is spreading deep into Europe, and the reason why is more horrifying than anything the Sasquatch has ever done in America. In June of 2026, I was in Romania for a routine work trip when my flight home was unexpectedly delayed until the following morning. With an entire day suddenly free, I rented a car and drove into the Carpathian Mountains. Like most Europeans, I only knew Bigfoot from American documentaries and the occasional video online. As far as I knew, if those stories had any truth to them at all, they belonged on the other side of the Atlantic. The trail I chose wasn't particularly difficult. I wasn't planning a long hike or trying to reach a summit. I just wanted to spend a few hours in the mountains before heading back to my hotel. It was June 21st, the summer solstice, so there was plenty of daylight left. The Carpathians were every bit as impressive as people had described. Dense forests stretched across the mountains in every direction, and after about an hour, the trail became noticeably quieter. I stopped at a rocky overlook to record the view, thinking it would be a nice souvenir of the trip. It wasn't until I played the video back a few minutes later that I realized I'd captured something I hadn't even noticed at the time. I had no idea that was only the first time I'd see it that day. I eventually pulled my phone back out just to see how the video had turned out. The scenery looked exactly how I remembered it, but right as I was about to close it, something moving near the tree line caught my eye. I dragged the video back a few seconds. For maybe 2 or 3 seconds, a large, dark figure crossed a narrow opening between the trees before disappearing into the forest again. It happened so quickly that I honestly wondered if I'd just mistaken a shadow for something moving. I zoomed in, but all that did was turn a blurry shape into an even blurrier one. What caught my attention was the way it moved. There was no hurry to it at all. I stood there watching the same stretch of forest for another minute, hoping I'd catch another glimpse. I figured I'd already missed my chance. It turned out the day was just getting started. I eventually gave up waiting and continued along the trail. Maybe 15 or 20 minutes later, I reached a section where the path curved around the side of the mountain. The trees opened up just enough to give me a view into the next valley. That's when I saw movement again. This time, I already had my phone in my hand, and I managed to record several seconds before it disappeared behind the trees. It was still too far away to make out much detail, but one thing stood out immediately. Whatever I'd been filming had something tucked against its chest. At first, I assumed it was carrying a bundle of branches or tall grass. Then, I noticed the bundle move. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me replay the clip a few more times. If it wasn't a bundle of vegetation, then what else could it be? The only explanation I could come up with was that it had caught some kind of animal and was carrying it through the forest. I never did figure out what was in that bundle right away. Instead, the trail handed me an entirely different clue. The trail climbed for another 10 minutes before a weathered wooden shepherd hut came into view just off the path. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, which wasn't unusual in that part of the mountains. I'd passed photographs of similar huts online while planning the drive, and plenty of them had simply been left behind as modern farming gradually replaced the old seasonal grazing routes. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked over for a closer look. From a distance, it looked exactly as I'd expected. Up close, a few things didn't quite add up. The roof was sagging, the walls were weathered, and one of the windows had long since disappeared. But the ground around the entrance looked oddly undisturbed. There weren't any fresh boot prints or signs that hikers had been using it, yet someone had recently cleared away loose branches that had fallen across the doorway. Working as a building inspector, I spend a lot of time noticing little details most people walk past without thinking. Maybe that's why this stood out to me. The hut had clearly been abandoned for years, but it didn't feel forgotten. As strange as that was, it ended up being only the first of several huts that caught my attention that afternoon. I didn't think much of it at first. Old huts are full of little oddities, especially after years of being exposed to the weather. If that had been the only one I found, I probably would have forgotten about it before I even got back to my hotel. About half an hour later, I came across another shepherd hut farther along the trail. It was in even worse condition than the first one. Part of the roof had collapsed, and the front wall leaned just enough that I was surprised it was still standing. Even so, I noticed something familiar almost immediately. The doorway had been cleared here too. Not perfectly, just enough for someone or something to get in and out without climbing over fallen branches. Inside, the floor was covered with old leaves, except for one patch near the back that looked noticeably flattened. It wasn't fresh enough to tell when it had happened, but it definitely hadn't been left completely untouched. That was the moment I stopped looking at the huts as separate discoveries. They were spread out along the same trail, each showing small signs that something had been using them without leaving behind the kind of evidence people usually do. Whatever I'd been filming earlier suddenly seemed a lot less random. The question wasn't just what I had seen anymore, it was where it was going. The farther I followed the trail, the more it felt as though I wasn't looking at isolated clues anymore. I was following the same story from one piece of evidence to the next. I left the second hut behind and stayed on the same trail, partly because I still had hours before I needed to head back, and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I'd found so far was connected somehow. The forest began thinning as the trail climbed higher, opening up longer views through the trees. Every now and then, I'd stop for a few seconds and scan the slopes ahead, more out of habit than expectation. Then I saw it again. It was farther up the mountainside this time, moving through the trees just long enough for me to start recording before the branches swallowed it again. The footage wasn't any clearer than before, but something about its behavior caught my attention almost immediately. After walking a short distance, it suddenly stopped and looked back over its shoulder. At first I assumed it had heard something, but it wasn't looking in my direction. It seemed to be watching the trail behind it instead. It stood there without moving, almost as if it was waiting for something, before continuing on exactly the same path as before. It didn't look lost or cautious. If anything, it looked patient. Whatever it was waiting for ended up answering more questions than any of the footage I'd recorded that day. My phone finally picked up a decent signal again. I sat down on a large rock to catch my breath and see if I could make sense of everything I'd seen so far. Honestly, I still wasn't ready to type Bigfoot Romania into the search bar. That felt like skipping about 10 other explanations I should have ruled out first. I eventually gave in and searched for Bigfoot sightings in Europe. The results were exactly what I'd expected. Old legends, blurry photographs, internet forums, and plenty of people arguing over whether Bigfoot existed at all. I scrolled for several minutes, hoping to find something that resembled what I'd been recording all afternoon. I didn't find anything that truly matched what I'd seen. The only thing that became clear was that almost every serious report still pointed back to North America. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it only made everything I'd seen in the Carpathians even harder to explain. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Whatever answers I was looking for weren't on the internet. They were still somewhere on that mountain. The next time I spotted it, I started paying just as much attention to what was happening behind it as I did to the animal itself. It didn't take nearly as long as I expected. The trail eventually climbed out of the thicker forest and crossed a wide alpine meadow. I had barely reached the other side when I spotted the same dark shape moving between the trees farther up the slope. I quickly started recording. Just like before, it walked for a short distance before stopping to look back the way it had come. This time I ignored the animal for a moment and focused the camera on the empty stretch of forest behind it, wondering what it kept looking at. I kept the camera pointed at the same spot, but nothing happened at first. Just as I was about to lower my phone, something moved between two trees. It was gone so quickly that I wasn't even sure I'd really seen it. I lowered my phone and stared at the same spot with my own eyes, but the forest looked completely still again. Maybe it was another animal. Maybe it was just the wind moving a low branch. Whatever it was, the larger animal seemed satisfied. It turned around and continued walking without looking back again. That tiny glimpse lasted less than a second. It was enough to convince me something else had been on that mountainside. With more questions than answers, I locked my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and continued up the trail. The trail became steeper after that, and before long, I was paying more attention to where I was putting my feet than to what was happening around me. Every now and then, I'd stop to catch my breath, glance toward the trees, and then carry on. It wasn't another sighting that made me stop this time. I hadn't gone much farther when a long wolf howl echoed somewhere across the valley. It wasn't close enough to make me panic, but it was close enough to make me stop walking. A second howl answered it from deeper in the forest, followed by another a few moments later. I stood there listening until the sounds gradually faded into the distance. Only then did I continue up the trail, reminding myself that the wolves probably wanted nothing to do with me. At the time, I had no idea something else in those mountains would soon give them a reason to leave. A cluster of berry bushes beside the trail had been stripped almost bare. At first, I didn't think much of it. Birds, deer, and even bears all feed on berries. But a few meters farther on, I noticed several young trees with long strips of bark missing much higher than I could comfortably reach. Another 100 meters beyond that, a large rock had been rolled over, exposing fresh soil and insects underneath. Each one of those things could probably be explained on its own. Seeing all of them within such a short stretch of trail felt different. The more I looked around, the more it seemed as though something large had passed through, not very long before I had. Whether that had anything to do with the animal I'd been following, I still couldn't say. A few minutes later, I finally found the first clue that left a lot less room for doubt. The clue didn't take long to appear. A fallen pine had come down across part of the trail, forcing me to step off the path and squeeze between a couple of younger trees. As I brushed past one of them, something caught my eye. Several long, dark strands of hair were snagged on a patch of rough bark at about shoulder height. They were coarse, almost wiry, and much longer than the fur I'd expect to find on any of the local animals I'd been reading about. I looked around, half expecting to spot a bear or some other perfectly ordinary explanation nearby, but the forest was completely still. For a second, I considered leaving the hair where it was. Then I remembered I had a few empty sample bags tucked away in my backpack. They weren't meant for anything like this, but they were better than stuffing loose hair into my pocket. I carefully removed a few strands, sealed them inside one of the bags, and slipped it into my pack. For all I knew, the hair could still belong to a bear or another animal I simply hadn't considered yet. Even so, it seemed foolish to walk away from the first piece of physical evidence I'd found all day. I held one of the strands up against the light for a moment before sealing it away. It was far thicker than human hair, yet nowhere near as soft as the fur I'd seen on bears. I still wasn't ready to call it Bigfoot hair, but for the first time that afternoon, I couldn't think of a single ordinary animal it obviously belonged to. I had barely zipped my backpack shut when I heard something moving farther uphill. It sounded closer than any of my previous sightings. I had barely zipped my backpack shut when I heard the wolves again. This time, they sounded much closer than before. And then, the forest fell silent so quickly that it caught me off guard. The wolves had stopped. The birds had stopped. Even the breeze seemed quieter than it had a moment earlier. Then I heard heavy cracks echoing from somewhere uphill. They weren't loud enough to be falling trees, but they were far heavier than the sort of noises you'd expect from deer or smaller animals. I started walking again, paying far more attention to the sounds around me than the trail itself. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, and sooner or later, another branch would snap somewhere ahead. It almost felt as though whatever was making the noise was moving through the forest at the same pace I was. Then I realized I couldn't hear the birds anymore. I stopped walking and listened for a few seconds. The breeze was still moving through the trees, but everything else had fallen strangely quiet. After hearing so much activity only moments earlier, the silence was impossible to ignore. The next branch to snap hadn't come from farther up the mountain like all the others. It came from somewhere off the trail, almost level with where I was standing. That was the first moment I realized I wasn't simply following it anymore, and it changed the rest of the afternoon completely. I stayed exactly where I was. The branch had snapped somewhere off to my right, close enough that there was no point pretending I'd imagined it. I slowly turned toward the trees and raised my phone, expecting whatever had made the noise to step into the open. It never did. The forest looked exactly as it had a moment earlier. Every tree, every patch of undergrowth, every shadow seemed completely still. I kept scanning the same area, convinced that if I looked long enough, I'd eventually spot some kind of movement. Instead, I heard it. A slow, steady breath drifted through the trees. It was so faint that I probably would have missed it if I'd still been walking. I listened, and before long, I heard another breath from almost the same spot. Whatever was hiding in those trees couldn't have been far away. The undergrowth was too dense to see more than a few meters between the trunks, and for the first time all afternoon, I realized I might be the one at a disadvantage. I was standing in the open while whatever I'd been following had all the cover it needed. Waiting for it to step into view suddenly didn't seem like much of a plan. If I wanted another look at it, I was going to have to leave the trail. Leaving the trail wasn't a decision I made lightly. The Carpathians are the kind of place where it's surprisingly easy to lose your bearings once the marked path disappears behind you. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that if I simply carried on hiking, I'd spend the rest of the day wondering what had been hiding only a few meters away. By then, I had wandered much farther from the marked trail than I'd ever intended. My phone had lost its signal again, and the forest around me looked almost identical in every direction. For a moment, I seriously considered turning back. It probably would have been the sensible thing to do. Instead, I kept going. I picked my way through the trees as quietly as I could, stopping every so often to listen before moving again. The ground was uneven, covered with roots, loose stones, and fallen branches that seemed determined to make as much noise as possible. I wasn't trying to sneak up on anything anymore. I just wanted to see what had been standing there. The forest slowly opened into a narrow clearing no bigger than a couple of tennis courts. Nothing moved. At first glance, it looked completely empty. Then I noticed several broken branches scattered across one side of the clearing. They hadn't snapped from age or bad weather. The wood was still fresh, and the leaves hadn't even started to wilt. Whatever had forced its way through, there couldn't have done it very long before I arrived. I raised my phone and started recording again, more out of habit than anything else. A few seconds into the recording, something moved at the far edge of the clearing. Getting closer wasn't the breakthrough I'd expected. The most important detail almost escaped my attention completely. Just before the larger animal disappeared into the trees, another figure stepped into the clearing. It was another Bigfoot. The second one stayed in the open for only a moment before following the first into the forest. But that was all it took. They moved the same way. They had the same broad build and the same unusually long arms. The only obvious difference was that the second one looked slightly smaller. In an instant, everything I'd been trying to figure out that afternoon finally made sense. The first one hadn't been stopping because it was confused or unsure of where it was going. It had been making sure the one behind it was keeping up. That answered one of the biggest questions I'd had all day. The next one was even harder to explain. If there were two of them, where were they going together? Realizing there were two of them changed the way I approached the rest of the hike. Up until then, I'd been trying to keep my eyes on the larger animal whenever it appeared. From that point on, I found myself searching the spaces behind it just as often. I followed the direction they'd taken, although I was careful to leave plenty of distance between us. Every now and then, I'd catch another glimpse through the trees before they disappeared again. The recordings weren't much better than the earlier ones, but they showed something I hadn't noticed before. I kept following from a distance, careful not to get any closer than I already was. Without warning, something crashed into the ground a few meters behind me. I spun around instinctively. A thick branch lay across the forest floor where it definitely hadn't been a moment earlier. It was far too large to have drifted down on its own, yet I hadn't heard the crack of a tree breaking overhead. Whether it had fallen or been thrown, I couldn't say. What I did know was that it had distracted me for only a second. By the time I turned back toward the hillside, both Bigfoots had disappeared. I followed them from a distance until the forest opened onto another hillside. It gave me my first clear view of both Bigfoots at the same time, and I started recording before they disappeared again. Seeing them side by side answered one question almost immediately. The second one was noticeably smaller. I stayed where I was for another moment, hoping they'd reappear, but they didn't. The trees were simply too dense to follow them from where I stood, so I climbed onto a large outcrop overlooking the slope. It wasn't particularly high, but it gave me a much better view through the breaks in the forest. After a minute or two, I finally spotted movement again. At first, I thought I'd found the family. Then I realized I was only looking at one of them. The larger Bigfoot was moving steadily across the opposite hillside, but there was no sign of the smaller one anymore. It never even crossed my mind that they might have gone in different directions. The larger one was easier to follow, so I started after it without thinking twice. At first, I thought I was making good progress. Every few minutes, I'd catch another glimpse of the larger Bigfoot moving through the trees before it disappeared again. It didn't take long for that to change. One fallen tree forced me to make a wide detour. A little farther on, then another patch of dense brush forced me to circle around again. None of it seemed unusual on its own. Forests are full of obstacles. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that every shortcut I tried somehow ended with something slowing me down. By the time I finally reached the next opening in the trees, the larger Bigfoot was nowhere to be seen. I raised my phone anyway and slowly scanned the hillside, hoping I'd catch another glimpse through the trees. For several seconds, there was nothing. It felt as though the entire forest had swallowed them without leaving behind a single trace. I eventually spotted movement again, but it wasn't the larger Bigfoot. It was the smaller one. I stopped and looked back toward the hillside where I'd last seen the larger one, and that was when everything suddenly made sense. While I'd been following the larger Bigfoot, the smaller one had quietly disappeared in another direction. The larger one hadn't been trying to get away. It had been keeping my attention long enough for the others to slip away unnoticed. As I stood there looking back toward the hillside, I couldn't stop thinking about the branch that had crashed behind me. Until then, I'd convinced myself it had probably fallen on its own. Now I wasn't nearly as sure. Whether it had been thrown or not almost didn't matter anymore. The larger Bigfoot had known I was there long before I'd realized it. What unsettled me most wasn't that it hadn't noticed me. It was that it hadn't tried to scare me away. It had simply distracted me long enough to protect the others. It took several more minutes before I found the family again. By then, I was more determined than ever to understand what I'd actually been following. They were moving through another break in the trees. This time, my attention wasn't on the larger Bigfoot. It was on whatever it had been carrying against its chest all afternoon. It wasn't behaving like an animal reacting on instinct. It was making decisions. For a brief moment, the animal shifted its grip. The bundle moved again. Only this time, it wasn't just a slight movement. A small arm reached out before quickly disappearing back against the larger Bigfoot's body. It had never been carrying branches or another animal. It was carrying a baby. The realization hit me almost immediately. I hadn't been following two Bigfoots across the Carpathians. I'd been following a family. Once I understood who they were, I stopped asking where they were going and started paying closer attention to how they were surviving. Over the next hour, I watched them search almost constantly for food, rarely staying in one place for more than a minute or two before moving on again. The longer I watched, the less they looked like animals, comfortably living in their own territory. They looked like a family still searching for one. By then, I wasn't wondering whether Bigfoot existed anymore. I was trying to understand how a family like this had managed to survive unnoticed in mountains visited by thousands of people every year. I stayed with them for as long as I could without getting any closer. The longer I watched, the more everything I'd seen that afternoon started fitting together. The abandoned huts suddenly made sense. They hadn't been random shelters I'd stumbled across during the hike. They were places this family already knew. Along with the constant search for food and the way the larger Bigfoot protected the others, they all pointed to the same conclusion. They weren't wandering through unfamiliar mountains anymore. They moved through those mountains with the confidence of something that already belonged there. They were all pieces of the same story. I just didn't realize that story was about to end somewhere I never would have expected. They changed direction once again, leaving the hiking trail behind. I stayed well back and followed as carefully as I could. Not much farther along, I noticed a faint game trail leading away from the hiking path. Curious, I followed it until it opened into a small clearing hidden between several large boulders. At first, it looked like another place the family had been using to rest, but something about it felt different. A low mound of earth sat near the center of the clearing, covered with carefully arranged branches and stones that looked far too deliberate to have ended up there naturally. I barely had time to take another look before movement caught my eye. The larger Bigfoot stepped quietly into the clearing with the baby still against its chest, and the smaller one followed close behind. Instead of searching for food or continuing through the forest, the family slowly gathered around the mound. None of them made any attempt to uncover the mound or search around it. They simply stood there in complete silence, as though the place itself mattered more than anything around it. At the time, I still didn't understand what I was looking at. What happened over the next few minutes gave me the clearest footage I'd recorded all day. The larger Bigfoot knelt beside the mound for several seconds before carefully brushing a few loose leaves back into place with one hand. I watched as the larger Bigfoot gently lowered the baby beside the mound before all three of them stood quietly around it. None of them searched for food or showed any interest in moving on. They simply remained there for several minutes. At first, I thought they had finally stopped to rest. For a moment, I even wondered if they were hiding something beneath the stones. But the longer they remained there, the less that explanation made sense. Nobody searched for food. Nobody wandered away. They had come to that clearing for one reason alone. It wasn't until much later that I understood what I'd witnessed. I hadn't stumbled across another resting place. I had been watching a Bigfoot family visit the grave of one of their own. The larger Bigfoot remained beside the baby, while the younger one slowly circled the edge of the clearing, stopping every so often to look back toward the trees before quietly returning. Every few moments, the older one would glance around the clearing, never seeming to let either of them stray very far. The longer I watched, the less it felt like I was observing wild animals. I was watching parents. Even without understanding a single sound they made, the way they stayed close together told its own story. When they finally started moving, they left the clearing the same way they'd entered it, quietly disappearing between the trees without making any unnecessary noise. I waited several more minutes before stepping into the clearing myself. By then, the forest was quiet again. Apart from the carefully arranged mound, there was almost nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. At the time, I thought I'd spent the day documenting a remarkable encounter. It wasn't until later that I realized how significant that footage might actually be. As a European, I'd always assumed Bigfoot stories belonged to North America. Not until I documented a Bigfoot family on June 21st, 2026, and realized they had already begun making the Carpathians their home. That day may have been the first time Bigfoot was ever documented in Europe, but I don't think it was the day they arrived. Samuel McKenna was 37 years old, and if you had asked him whether Bigfoot was real, he probably would have smiled and started talking about bears, bad lighting, and wishful thinking. He was a field researcher specializing in large mammal ecology who'd spent years studying wildlife in some of the most remote forests in North America, and he had a reputation for explaining away the unexplained. Sam left for what he expected would be a routine 5-day research expedition. He'd done trips like this plenty of times before, hiking deep into the forest to document wildlife that most people never got to see. The tracks started less than a mile from camp. Sam noticed them while following what he thought was a game trail, and right away they bothered him. Not because they were huge, although they were, but because they didn't look like anything he was used to seeing. They weren't hoof prints or paw prints, and they definitely weren't from a bear. Each one looked almost human. His first instinct wasn't Bigfoot. It was that somebody else had wandered into the area barefoot, which would have been strange enough on its own. But the deeper he looked, the less that made sense. The stride was too long, the impressions were far too deep, and whatever left them had moved through thick brush that would have slowed down just about anything else. Most people would have turned around. Sam followed them, and before long, he realized they weren't the only tracks in those woods anymore. The deeper Sam followed the tracks, the more he felt like he wasn't alone. At first, he brushed it off. Forests are noisy places, trees creak, branches fall, and animals move through the underbrush. After years of working in the field, he knew better than to jump at every sound. But this was different. Every so often, he'd hear a heavy footstep somewhere behind him, and the moment he stopped to listen, it would stop too. A few minutes later, a branch would snap from another direction. He'd turn, wait, and find nothing. It happened often enough that even Sam started paying attention because whatever was out there seemed determined to stay just out of sight. He made it back to camp before sunset, but one thing stayed with him for the rest of the day. That night, he found out he wasn't imagining it. By the time the sun went down, Sam had convinced himself the strange feeling would pass. He cooked dinner, organized the day's photos, and recorded his usual video log. He even joked that if those footprints ended up belonging to the world's most athletic bear, he was never going to hear the end of it from his friends. Sometime after midnight, he woke up to the sound of something moving outside his tent. At first it was slow, almost careful, like heavy footsteps trying not to make any noise. A few moments later, the footsteps came back from a different direction. For the next 20 minutes, whatever was outside circled the campsite without ever coming into view. Every so often, a branch cracked under an incredible amount of weight, then the forest would go silent again. Sam never unzipped the tent, and honestly, I probably wouldn't have either. When morning came, he stepped outside expecting to find tracks from a bear or an elk. Instead, the same enormous footprints from the day before circled the campsite just beyond the trees. Whatever had walked around his camp that night was still out there. The question was, would Sam find it first, or would it find him? The next morning, he didn't waste any time. After taking a few more photos of the footprints around camp, he packed his gear, grabbed the camera, and started following the trail again. Whatever had been outside the tent had left a path that was surprisingly easy to follow, almost like it hadn't cared whether anyone found it. About an hour later, the trail opened into a small clearing. That's where he saw it. Standing between two trees was a massive figure, covered in dark brown hair. It was easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms that hung unusually low at its sides. It wasn't crouching or hiding. It was standing completely still, facing in his direction. Instead of running, he did exactly what you'd expect a researcher to do. He raised the camera. The recording lasted only a few seconds before the creature calmly stepped behind a thick pine tree. He kept filming, fully expecting it to come out the other side, but it never did. By the time he reached the tree, the creature was gone. There was nowhere it could have disappeared to that quickly, and the only thing left behind were the same enormous footprints pressed deep into the forest floor. Later that afternoon, while recording his daily video log, he looked into the camera, let out a quiet laugh, and said, "Well, I guess Bigfoot's real." Honestly, I don't think even he realized that was only the beginning. From that point on, the trip wasn't about proving Bigfoot existed anymore. He'd already done that for himself. What he wanted now was to understand what he had just seen. The strange part was how easy it was to find again. Later that afternoon, he spotted it a second time, this time moving slowly along a ridgeline about 200 yards away. It never ran. It never looked startled. If anything, it seemed completely comfortable with the fact that someone was watching. He still thought he was the one observing Bigfoot. He had no idea it was starting to let him get closer. The more footage Sam reviewed, the less Bigfoot made sense. Every large animal he'd ever studied had one thing in common. The moment they realized a person was nearby, they either ran, hid, or became defensive. Bears didn't stand around waiting to be filmed. Wolves certainly didn't. They avoided people whenever they could. Bigfoot did neither of those things. That afternoon, he found it again, feeding along the edge of a clearing. Instead of disappearing when it noticed him, it simply looked up for a few seconds before going back to what it was doing. It wasn't frightened, curious, or defensive. That's what really caught his attention. In one of his notes that evening, he wrote that Bigfoot didn't seem comfortable around people. It seemed familiar with them. There's a big difference between those two things. During his video log that night, he laughed and said, "I've spent years trying to get bears to ignore me. Turns out the only thing that doesn't care that I'm here is Bigfoot." Leave it to Sam to crack a joke after spending the day filming Bigfoot. I don't think he realized he had just described the most unsettling part of the entire story. Bigfoot wasn't acting like an animal that had just discovered a human. It was acting like a human was nothing new. Later that afternoon, Sam decided to try something he'd never normally do. Instead of waiting for Bigfoot to cross his path again, he quietly settled into a spot overlooking the clearing where he'd seen it earlier and waited. Nearly 2 hours passed before movement caught his eye. Bigfoot stepped out from the trees, paused, and looked straight toward the ridge where he was sitting. A few seconds later, it started walking in his direction. Sam stayed where he was with the camera rolling as the distance slowly closed to about 100 yards. Even from there, it was obvious how enormous the creature really was. Then it stopped. It simply stood there, watching him for nearly a minute before turning and disappearing into the trees without the slightest effort to hide itself. That night's recording was noticeably shorter. He still sounded excited, but something had changed. It no longer felt like he was choosing these encounters. The way he saw it, Bigfoot was deciding how close it was willing to let him get. Looking back, I think that's exactly what was happening. The following morning started quietly. Sam headed back toward the same area expecting another glimpse, but the forest felt different. He walked for nearly 3 hours without finding a single fresh track, and for the first time since arriving, it almost felt like Bigfoot had simply disappeared. Then he found one of his trail cameras. The strange part wasn't where it was how it had been left. The camera was sitting upright on a large, flat rock nearly 50 yards from where he'd mounted it the day before. It wasn't damaged. Someone, or something, had carefully removed it from the tree and left it where he was sure to find it. The last few minutes of footage showed Bigfoot walking straight toward the camera. It stopped just a few feet away, stared into the lens for several long seconds, then reached forward with one enormous hand. Recording ended there. In that evening's video log, he couldn't stop thinking about one question. If Bigfoot understood enough to notice the camera, how much else had it noticed about him? When he recovered the camera, Sam expected the mystery to end there. Instead, it raised another question. The memory card had continued recording for a few seconds after Bigfoot picked up the camera. The image swung wildly through the trees before settling on the trail Sam had been using since he arrived. Bigfoot wasn't looking at the camera anymore. It was looking down the path. That thought stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. He followed the trail again, but after a while, the footprints simply disappeared, ending in the middle of the forest with no tracks leading away. He'd spent years tracking wildlife, but he'd never seen an animal that seemed to understand how to avoid being tracked. The next morning, Bigfoot made sure he didn't have to go looking for it. Waiting just beyond the edge of camp was one of the trail markers he'd planted nearly half a mile away. It had been pulled from the ground and carefully leaned against a tree where he couldn't miss it. There were no fresh footprints leading to or from it. Moving the trail marker was unsettling enough. Knowing something had found it in the first place was even worse. What if he wasn't the one tracking Bigfoot anymore? The trail marker stayed on his mind for the rest of the day, but it wasn't enough to scare him away. If anything, it made him even more determined to figure out what was happening. That afternoon, he returned to the same clearing where he'd filmed Bigfoot the day before. It didn't take long before the familiar figure stepped out from the trees. Just like before, he raised the camera and started recording. This time, Bigfoot didn't stand still. It took a few slow steps in his direction before stopping. Then, without any warning, Bigfoot bent down, picked up a rock about the size of a basketball, and threw it. The rock slammed into a tree no more than 15 feet to Sam's right, sending bark flying across the forest floor. With something that large, missing by 15 feet didn't feel accidental. That evening, he couldn't stop replaying the encounter, trying to decide whether Bigfoot had been trying to scare him or warn him. Either way, the message had been received. The rock stayed on his mind the rest of the day, but by the following morning, something else had taken its place. The knocking started just after sunrise. 3 loud knocks echoed through the trees somewhere off to his left. They weren't close enough to make him jump, but they were deliberate enough to make him stop walking. He waited for a few moments, listening, before convincing himself it was probably just a woodpecker. That seemed a lot more reasonable than any of the other possibilities. About a minute later, 3 more knocks echoed through the forest. This time they came from a completely different direction. He stood there for nearly a minute without moving, trying to figure out what he was hearing. There were no voices, no footsteps, no movement through the brush. Just those slow, deliberate knocks spaced a few seconds apart, followed by silence. He recorded the sound before continuing on, but it stayed with him for the rest of the day. Before turning the camera off that evening, he laughed and said that maybe the forest was trying to teach him Morse code. I'll admit, that one got a laugh out of me too. The problem was, the knocking hadn't stopped. It was getting closer. The knocking followed him for most of the morning. Sometimes it echoed from somewhere ahead of him. Other times it came from farther off to his right. Every time he changed direction, the sound seemed to shift with him, but no matter where he looked, he never caught so much as a glimpse of Bigfoot. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up a fallen branch and struck the nearest tree 3 times, then stood there, waiting. For nearly half a minute, nothing happened, and I can only imagine how ridiculous he must have felt standing in the middle of the forest knocking on a tree. Then 3 knocks came back from somewhere deeper in the woods. He didn't answer a second time. Instead, he switched on the camera and started recording, hoping whatever had made the sound would reveal itself. Nothing ever stepped out of the trees. The only thing the microphone picked up was another series of slow, deliberate knocks echoing through the forest before everything went quiet again. He spent the last few minutes of that day's recording talking through every explanation he could think of. Maybe another person was out there. Maybe there was some natural cause he hadn't considered. But after everything he'd seen over the last few days, even he sounded like he was running out of ordinary answers. The next time the knocking started, it wasn't coming from just one direction. The knocking came back the following afternoon while he was hiking along a narrow ridge. At first it sounded just like the day before. 3 slow knocks somewhere off in the distance. He stopped, listened, and waited for another one. It came almost immediately. The second series of knocks echoed from somewhere behind him. He turned around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. Before he could take another step, 3 more knocks rolled through the forest from his left. They weren't loud or frantic. If anything, they sounded deliberate, almost measured, as though something was answering from different parts of the woods. Sam stood there for several minutes, slowly turning in place with the camera rolling. He never caught movement on film, but he did capture the sounds. Listening to the audio later, you can clearly hear the knocks coming from different directions, only seconds apart. He didn't say much before ending the recording that night. The joking had mostly disappeared by then. He simply said he couldn't figure out how one thing could be making those sounds from opposite sides of the forest so quickly. I kept replaying that part of the recording. The more I listened, the less I believed there was only one Bigfoot out there. The rest of the afternoon passed without another sighting, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had changed. It wasn't any quieter than before. If anything, it was the opposite. Every now and then, he'd catch the sound of a branch bending under something heavy, only for it to stop the moment he looked in that direction. Late in the day, he reached another clearing and decided to stop for a few minutes to swap camera batteries and review some of the footage he'd collected. While he was looking down at the screen, something caught his eye in the corner of the playback. Standing farther back between the trees was another dark figure, almost completely hidden by the shadows. It was only visible for a second or two before the camera shifted away, but when he replayed the clip, it was still there. The strange part was where it had been standing. The first Bigfoot had been in front of him. The second one had been behind it, watching from the tree line without ever stepping into the open. He spent the next several minutes searching the area, but by then, the forest looked completely empty again. Before ending the recording that night, he quietly said something that really stuck with me. "I don't think I've been following just one." And if he was right, that meant he'd been surrounded without even realizing it. He barely covered any ground the next day. Every time he started following a fresh set of tracks, another sound somewhere behind him would make him stop and look back. It felt impossible to focus when he could never tell where anything was anymore. The forest that had seemed so open a few days earlier now felt crowded, even though he still couldn't see anyone. A few minutes later, he caught a dark figure slipping between two trees less than 50 yards away. He took off after it without thinking, camera in one hand and backpack bouncing against his shoulders. By the time he reached the spot where he'd seen it, the figure was gone. All that remained were a fresh set of enormous footprints, and about 30 yards farther ahead, another set was waiting. He followed the new set of footprints for another 20 minutes before something finally clicked. No matter which direction they went, they always seemed to stay just far enough ahead to keep him moving. Every time he thought he was about to catch up, the tracks would veer around another ridge or disappear behind another stand of trees, only to reappear a little farther on. He mentioned something in his notes that really stood out to me. After years of tracking animals, he'd never seen one leave such an easy trail to follow. Most wildlife avoided being found. Whatever he was following almost seemed to be doing the opposite. For the first time, he stopped and seriously considered turning back. Instead, he kept following. He hadn't gone much farther when another movement caught his eye. Bigfoot stepped out from behind a cluster of trees, closer than ever before. There couldn't have been more than 40 feet between them. For several long seconds, they simply stared at each other. Sam slowly lifted the camera and started recording, expecting the creature to slip back into the trees like it always had. Instead, it stayed exactly where it was. You can actually hear his breathing pick up on the recording. After everything he'd seen over the past few days, this was the first time he seemed genuinely unsure of what to do next. Instead of taking another step forward, he slowly began backing away, careful not to turn his back. Bigfoot never came after him. It just stood there, watching until he disappeared into the trees. Looking back, I think that was the first time Sam realized there was a difference between being allowed to get close and being allowed to leave. By the fifth morning, Sam looked exhausted. The excitement that had carried him through the first few days was gone. His voice was quieter, and there were long stretches in the recordings where he simply stared into the trees without saying anything. He mentioned he hadn't slept much the night before. Between the knocking, the footsteps, and the feeling that something was always just outside camp, real sleep had become hard to come by. Even so, he wasn't ready to leave. He packed up his gear, looked over the map one last time, and decided to follow the same trail where he'd had the closest encounter the day before. He said if he could just get one clear explanation for everything that had happened, the trip would be worth it. I think that's the moment he stopped thinking like a researcher. He was chasing answers, and whatever was waiting deeper in that forest seemed more than willing to give him one. He found the trail almost immediately, but this time something felt different. The footprints were easy to follow, almost too easy. Every few hundred yards, another fresh print appeared in the soft ground, just enough to keep him moving without ever letting him catch up. After another 10 minutes, he realized the forest had gone completely silent. There weren't any birds calling overhead or squirrels darting through the brush. Even the constant background noise he'd gotten used to over the past few days had disappeared. After years of working outdoors, Sam knew silence like that usually meant every other animal had already decided it was safer to leave. A branch cracked somewhere ahead. He raised the camera and slowly started walking toward the sound. before he'd taken more than a few steps, another branch snapped behind him. He turned immediately, expecting to catch something moving between the trees, but there was nothing there except rows of pines stretching in every direction. He kept recording as he moved forward, stopping every few yards to listen. Nothing else made a sound. It wasn't until later, while reviewing the footage at camp, that he noticed a dark figure slipping through the trees off to his right. It only appeared for a second before disappearing again. But one thing became painfully obvious. It hadn't been in front of him. It had been walking alongside him the entire time. That discovery stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. Instead of heading back to camp, he sat down with the map, his notes, and the GPS recordings from the past few days, trying to make sense of where all these encounters had happened. At first, nothing stood out. Then he started drawing lines between each location. The first sighting, the ridgeline, the clearing, the trail camera, the place where the rock had landed. None of them were random. They formed a slow, winding path that led deeper into the forest. He spent the next few minutes staring at the map without saying a word. When he finally spoke, he wondered out loud if he'd been asking the wrong question the entire time. Instead of trying to figure out where Bigfoot was going, maybe he should have been asking where Bigfoot was taking him. He folded the map, packed it away, and kept walking. The next set of footprints was already waiting for him. The footprints led him into a narrow valley he'd never planned on visiting. It wasn't marked on any of his original routes, and judging by how overgrown the trail had become, very few people had walked through it in a long time. The first thing he noticed was the size of the trees. They were older, taller, and packed so tightly together that very little sunlight reached the ground. Even in the middle of the afternoon, the whole valley felt strangely dim. Then he started seeing footprints. Some looked fresh, while others had already begun filling with leaves and pine needles. They crossed over one another in every direction, making it almost impossible to tell which way any one of them had gone. He slowly turned the camera, trying to capture as much of the ground as possible. For the first time since arriving, Sam stopped following the tracks. He'd finally reached the place where they all seemed to lead. He hadn't been in the valley long before movement caught his eye. A dark figure stepped out from behind a massive cedar no more than 30 yards away. Instead of disappearing, it stood there watching while he slowly raised the camera. A few seconds later, another figure moved between the trees farther up the valley, then another. He slowly turned in a circle, but no matter where he pointed the camera, there always seemed to be another shape standing just beyond the tree line. He wasn't looking at a lone Bigfoot anymore. He'd walked into their territory. That was enough. After spending nearly an hour in the valley, Sam made his way back toward camp without stopping to film anything else. The excitement that had brought him into the forest was gone. Whatever answers he'd been looking for, he felt like he'd already found more than he was prepared for. Back at camp, he started packing his gear and mentioned that leaving in the morning was probably the smartest decision he'd made all week. He even laughed that his dogs were going to get a very long walk when he got home because he'd had enough of sleeping in the woods. Then he opened the camera one last time to review the footage from the valley. That's when he noticed one of the figures hadn't been watching from a distance. It had been following him back toward camp. Sam headed back without stopping again, and for the first time since the trip began, he wasn't thinking about finding Bigfoot. He was thinking about getting home. He spent the evening packing most of his gear and making sure everything was ready for an early start the next morning. He even mentioned that 5 days in the woods had been more than enough, and that a hot meal and a real bed were sounding better by the hour. Before calling it a night, he sat down to review the footage from the valley one last time. Every encounter over the past 5 days had happened deeper in the forest than the one before it. Without realizing it, he'd spent the entire expedition walking exactly where Bigfoot wanted him to go. The next morning, Sam broke camp just after sunrise and started hiking toward the trailhead. For the first hour, everything felt almost normal. There weren't any strange sounds, no movement between the trees, and no fresh footprints waiting for him around the next bend. After everything that had happened over the past 5 days, the silence almost felt reassuring. Then he spotted another footprint. It was fresh. A few minutes later, there was another. The tracks weren't leading away from him anymore. They were heading in the same direction he was, appearing every so often along the trail as though something had passed through only moments earlier. He slowed down, scanning the woods on either side of the path, but never saw what had made them. It looked like he wasn't the only one leaving the valley. Sam never made it out that morning. About an hour after leaving camp, the camera captured its closest footage yet. One Bigfoot stepped out from behind a line of trees less than 20 feet away and stood perfectly still, staring at him. And then another Bigfoot emerged farther down the trail. Then another appeared behind him. He slowly turned in a circle, but every direction was the same. One stood ahead of him, another off to his left, another behind him. They weren't surrounding him by accident. They were blocking every way out. The next few minutes were some of the hardest parts of the footage to watch. The camera shook as Sam slowly backed away, never taking his eyes off the tree line. The Bigfoot didn't chase him, but they didn't leave either. Every time he tried to back away, another dark figure would quietly appear farther ahead, forcing him to stop again. He stopped talking completely. The occasional heavy breath was the only reminder that the camera was still recording. Then, without warning, he turned and started running. The footage became almost impossible to follow after that. The camera bounced wildly as Sam pushed through the trees, and every few seconds, another loud crack echoed somewhere behind him. More than once he glanced over his shoulder, but whatever was chasing him never stayed in frame long enough to make out clearly. Then the camera suddenly stopped moving. For a few seconds, all it captured was the forest. A heavy set of footsteps came from somewhere just outside the frame. The camera tilted sharply toward the ground, and that was the last thing it ever recorded. Search teams reached Sam's campsite later that week after he failed to return. His tent was still standing, most of his equipment was exactly where he'd left it, and there was no sign that he'd ever made it back. The only reason anyone knows what happened over those 5 days is because of the backup drive they recovered with his recordings, field notes, and camera footage. The files end exactly where you just saw them. After that, there isn't another recording, another note, or any clue that explains what happened to Samuel McKenna. But one thing is certain. Samuel McKenna spent 5 days filming what he believed was Bigfoot. Then he vanished without a trace. My name is Todd, and I've worked construction for about 20 years. Long weeks, early mornings. By the end of the day, you're usually sore, tired, and ready to be anywhere else. Fishing is what I do when I need to get away from all of that. I always bring a camera when I go out by myself. You could say it's for my fishing YouTube channel or my future career as an influencer. Nah, I work construction. By the time the weekend rolls around, my back already has enough complaints without me trying to film content. The real reason is a lot less exciting. I fish remote water mostly, places where you're not getting a signal, no matter what carrier you're using. On August 3rd, 2024, I filmed Bigfoot swimming across that lake. I'd been out on the water since before 6 that morning. By then, I already had a decent catch on the stringer, a few lines working different spots, and several hours of doing what fishing mostly consists of, waiting. Honestly, that's half the reason I like it. Nobody needs anything from you. The next thing I remember is waking up to the boat rocking beneath me. Something was moving in the water. I grabbed the side of the boat and sat up. Whatever had woken me was already moving away, heading toward the far side of the lake. For a second, I thought maybe a big fish had hit one of my lines and pulled the boat around. Then I got a better look at the disturbance in the water. That wasn't a fish. I checked my lines anyway. Everything looked normal. Most of whatever it was stayed underwater. From where I was sitting, all I could see was a dark shape moving across the lake. My first guess was a bear. Bears can swim, and I've seen them cross water before. Then I thought maybe it was a dog. The problem was that it didn't move like either one. The camera was already running. I remember looking over at it, then back at the thing in the water, thinking I'd probably want footage of whatever this turned out to be. The farther it got across the lake, the more I could see of it. It was riding higher in the water now, and that's when the way it swam started getting my attention. It was too smooth, too controlled. Most animals crossing open water look like they're trying to get to the other side as quickly as possible. This thing wasn't. It moved at the same steady pace the entire time, like swimming across the lake was no effort at all. And then I noticed the arms. Whatever I was looking at, it wasn't paddling with 4 legs. It was swimming with 2 arms. That's when I stopped telling myself it was an animal. It was Bigfoot, swimming across my lake like it owned the place, which, looking back on everything that happened after, it basically did. By that point, I wasn't interested in getting any closer. I reached over and started the engine, not because I was trying to outrun it, but because putting a little distance between us suddenly seemed like a good idea. The second the motor turned over, Bigfoot changed direction. Up until then, it had been heading toward the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving fast, and it wasn't paying any attention to me as far as I could tell. Then the engine started, and it turned around around and began swimming toward the boat. The change was immediate enough that I noticed it before I even had time to wonder whether starting the motor had been the right call. I remember watching it for a few seconds, expecting it to turn away again. The sound of the engine had probably caught its attention. At least, that was the explanation I settled on at the time. So I pulled the throttle back and let the boat drift. I figured that if I sat still for a minute, it would lose interest and continue on its way. Instead, it held the same course. As the boat drifted and the lake stayed quiet around me, Bigfoot kept swimming straight in my direction. I watched it for another minute or two, and that's when I started noticing something I hadn't before. Every time the boat shifted position, Bigfoot adjusted with it. The changes were small enough that I probably wouldn't have noticed them if I hadn't been staring directly at it. But they were there. The boat would drift a little, and a few seconds later, Bigfoot would make a correction of its own. Then it would happen again. That was the point where the explanation I'd been holding on to started falling apart. Bigfoot had already been crossing the lake before I started the engine. It already had a direction. Then it turned around, and ever since then, it had been making small adjustments to stay lined up with the boat. By then, Bigfoot was close enough that I could clearly see its head and shoulders above the water. Bigfoot went under without any warning. 1 second it was there, still heading toward the boat, and the next it slipped beneath the surface. No splash, no sudden movement. It just disappeared. A few seconds later, the lake looked completely still again. I kept watching the spot where it went down, expecting it to come back up. That seemed like the obvious thing it would do. If something is swimming toward you and goes underwater, you expect it to surface somewhere along the same path, but nothing came up. I kept my eyes on that part of the lake for a while, then started looking farther out. Maybe it had changed direction underwater. Maybe it had surfaced somewhere I wasn't expecting. The water stayed flat everywhere I checked. I kept waiting for it to surface again. It never did. At least not where I was looking. It came up on my left, not where I'd been watching, not even close. Somehow it had changed direction underwater without me tracking it at all. By the time I caught the movement and turned my head, it was already there, off the side of the boat. The first thing that struck me was how little water it disturbed coming back up. Something that size should have made a lot more commotion. Instead, it surfaced almost quietly, like it had done it 1,000 times before. It was close enough that I could see it clearly for the first time. I glanced at the engine, then back at Bigfoot. At that point, I wasn't interested in getting a better look or figuring out what it wanted. I just wanted the boat moving. I got the engine running and pushed the throttle as far as it would go. At first, I thought that was going to be the end of it. The boat picked up speed, the distance started opening up, and when I looked back, Bigfoot was still sitting where I'd left it. For a few seconds, I actually thought I'd made the right call. Then I looked back again. Bigfoot was moving. What bothered me wasn't that it had started following me again. It was how quickly it was moving through the water. I've spent enough time around water to know what swimming is supposed to look like. This didn't look like any person or animal I'd ever seen. The boat was running hard, but the distance between us wasn't growing the way it should have been. Every time I checked over my shoulder, Bigfoot was still there, not falling behind, not giving up, just moving through the water at a pace that didn't make any sense. I pushed the boat harder. Bigfoot matched it. I cut left, trying to create an angle that might work in my favor. Bigfoot adjusted. Every move I made, it had an answer for. Every time I looked back, it was still there, not gaining much, not falling behind either, just staying exactly where it wanted to be. After a few minutes of that, I had to accept something I really didn't want to accept. I wasn't going to outrun it on this lake. I'd already gotten a good look at Bigfoot beside the boat. With both of us moving across open water, though, I had more time to actually see it. I knew it was big. I just hadn't realized big apparently went all the way up to that. I work construction. Estimating dimensions is part of the job, and this thing was enormous. The shoulders alone looked wider than they had any right to be. The arms were even stranger up close. Every stroke covered an unbelievable amount of distance, which explained why it had no trouble staying with the boat. And there was a lot more of it above the water than I'd realized. From a distance, I'd only been catching pieces of it. Up close, there was no mistaking the scale. The head, the shoulders, the length of the arms, everything about it looked oversized. I already knew I was looking at Bigfoot. Getting a better look didn't make it any easier to believe. At some point, Bigfoot stopped trying to keep pace with the boat and started pulling ahead of it. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It moved out in front of me, disappeared, underwater, and I figured it had finally decided to break off and go somewhere else. A few seconds later, it came back up directly in my path. I turned the boat and went around it. Bigfoot stayed on the surface long enough for me to clear past, then disappeared underwater again. A few minutes later, it did the same thing again. Then it happened again after that. Every time I picked a direction, Bigfoot somehow ended up there first. It would surface ahead of me, force me to change course, then disappear and do it again somewhere else. After a while, it started feeling less like a chase and more like I was losing a game I didn't know I was playing. I remember looking past it toward open water and trying another angle. A minute later, Bigfoot was back in front of me. That was when I stopped thinking about where it was. I started paying attention to where it kept making me go, and every time I changed course, I found myself getting pushed back toward the same stretch of shoreline I'd been fishing near all morning. By that point, I had stopped trying to understand why Bigfoot wanted me near that stretch of shoreline. I was too busy trying to stay ahead of it. The chase kept going. Every time Bigfoot disappeared underwater, I found myself looking ahead, waiting to see where it was going to surface next. Most of the time, I wasn't wrong. It would come up, force me to adjust course, then vanish again before I could get anywhere near it. At one point, it surfaced close enough that I got another good look at it. Not close enough to touch the boat, but close enough that I could clearly see where it was looking. For the first time since this started, its attention shifted away from me. Just for a second. Its head turned slightly, and its eyes dropped toward the water beside the boat. Then it looked back at me and kept moving like nothing had happened. I noticed it because it stood out. Up until then, Bigfoot had seemed completely focused on where I was going and what the boat was doing. That was the first time I'd seen it pay attention to anything else. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Looking back, I probably should have. A few minutes later, Bigfoot surfaced again, and this time, something was different. Instead of getting ahead of the boat, it came up alongside it. For the first time since the chase started, its attention wasn't on me. It was on the stringer. The fish had been trailing beside the boat all morning. I'd caught them hours earlier and barely thought about them since. At that point, staying out of the water seemed a lot more important than whatever I'd caught. Bigfoot angled toward them. At first, I thought it was just another course change. Then, it reached out with one of those long arms and grabbed the stringer. The whole thing happened so fast I barely had time to react. One moment the fish were beside the boat. The next, they were gone. Bigfoot ripped the stringer free, turned away from me, and started heading toward shore. Just like that, the chase stopped. I watched it swim away, carrying every fish I'd caught that morning. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the worst fishing trip of my life. Instead, I was seriously considering throwing in the tackle box for free. It felt like the best trade I'd ever made. I didn't waste any time testing the theory. The second Bigfoot turned away, I kept the boat moving and put as much distance between us as I could. Every few seconds, I'd look back, expecting it to change its mind and come after me again. It never did. Bigfoot swam straight toward the shoreline, carrying the fish. From where I was, I couldn't see exactly what it was doing once it got there. The bank was lined with trees and brush, and after a while, all I could make out was its shape near the water's edge. Then even that stopped moving. For the first time since waking up to the boat rocking, nothing was happening. No course changes. No giant shape cutting through the water toward me. No wondering where it was going to surface next, just a lake. I slowed the boat down and kept watching the shoreline. Bigfoot stayed there. Whatever it was doing, it didn't seem interested in me anymore. Maybe it had been the fish. The more I thought about it, the more that explanation started making sense. The fish were the only thing I'd brought into that lake that morning. Maybe the chase had never been about me at all. I wasn't completely relaxed, but I could feel the tension starting to drain away. Losing the fish suddenly felt like a pretty good deal. I sat there watching the shoreline for a while, waiting to see if anything else was going to happen. Nothing did. Bigfoot stayed out of the water. The boat drifted. The engine idled. Little by little, the whole thing started feeling less like an active emergency and more like something I might actually get away from. If I was smart, I probably would have left right then and never come back to that lake. Instead, I kept watching. After everything that had happened, part of me wanted to know what Bigfoot was doing over there and why the fish had suddenly mattered so much. For several minutes, nothing changed. Then I saw movement. At first, I thought Bigfoot was just shifting position near the shoreline. A second later, I realized it was heading back toward the water. I watched it step in and start swimming away from shore. The first thing I told myself was that it was probably leaving. Maybe it had what it wanted and was heading somewhere else. That explanation lasted right up until I realized the direction it was swimming. It wasn't heading down the shoreline. It wasn't crossing to the far side of the lake. It was coming back toward me. The fish were gone. Bigfoot had them. I remember thinking, "You already took my fish, man. What else do you want?" The closer Bigfoot got, the harder it became to hold on to the idea that any of this had been about the fish. If the fish were the problem should have been over. It had them. I'd given them up without a fight. As far as I was concerned, the transaction was complete. Bigfoot apparently had a different opinion. I started the boat moving again and tried putting some distance between us. Bigfoot answered by changing direction and matching me almost immediately, not chasing the way it had earlier, not trying to cut me off, just staying close enough to make it clear that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as pointing the boat in the opposite direction and driving away. By then, I'd spent enough time watching its behavior to know there was a reason for it. Nothing about what it had done that morning felt random. The course changes. The way it kept steering me back toward the same section of shoreline. The fish. Now this. The fish had mattered, but they hadn't mattered enough to explain everything else. That was when it finally hit me that Bigfoot wasn't protecting the fish from me. It was protecting something else. I just didn't know what. Once that idea got into my head, I couldn't stop looking toward that section of shoreline. I still couldn't see anything unusual over there, but I was starting to believe there was a reason Bigfoot cared so much about keeping me away from it. I didn't get much time to think about it. Bigfoot disappeared underwater again. At that point, that was almost worse than seeing it. Every time it went under, there was a few-second window where I had no idea where it was or what it was about to do next. I was still scanning the surface when something slammed into the side of the boat. The impact wasn't enough to flip the boat or cause any real damage, but it hit hard enough to shove the entire thing sideways across the water. I grabbed the seat with one hand and nearly lost my footing anyway. For a second, I thought I'd hit something submerged. Then I looked over the side. Bigfoot was right there. One arm was still against the hull. That's when I realized it hadn't been an accident. It hadn't brushed the boat or bumped into it while swimming. Bigfoot had put its hand on the hull and shoved the boat. And if that was supposed to be a warning, it got the message across pretty clearly. I'd spent the entire morning hoping Bigfoot would leave me alone. Apparently, Bigfoot had reached the same conclusion about me. I pushed the throttle forward and tried putting some distance between us again. Bigfoot disappeared underwater almost immediately. For a few seconds, I lost sight of it completely. Then something hit the bottom of the boat. The impact came from directly underneath me. The bow lifted, the entire boat lurched upward, and then slammed back down into the water hard enough to throw gear across the deck. One of my tackle boxes tipped over. A rod came loose and bounced against the side of the hull. I got thrown sideways and had to grab the seat to keep from going down. I'd spent enough time around boats to know the difference between hitting something and being hit by something I'd definitely just been hit. The shove earlier had moved the boat. This hit felt like something had tried to lift it out of the water. The boat rocked hard for several seconds before finally settling back down. I looked over one side, then the other, expecting to see Bigfoot somewhere nearby. There was nothing. A few moments earlier, I knew exactly where it was. Now it could have been anywhere under the boat. I kept looking over the side, trying to spot some sign of where Bigfoot had gone. The water looked completely normal. If it hadn't just hit the boat from below, I would have had no reason to think anything was under me at all. That's when I noticed the engine wasn't sounding right. The impact had rattled the entire boat and apparently the motor along with it. I pushed the throttle and got almost nothing back. The engine sputtered, struggled for a few seconds, and then died completely. I tried starting it again a couple of times, but the engine wasn't interested. At that point, I was sitting in the middle of the lake with a dead motor and a Bigfoot somewhere underneath me. If there was ever a time for it to leave, that would have been a great time. I was reaching for the ignition again when the water beside the boat suddenly moved. Bigfoot surfaced so close that I instinctively pulled back. One hand came up over the side of the hull, then the other. Before I could fully process what I was looking at, it wrapped both hands around the edge of the boat. At first, I thought it was trying to pull itself aboard. That idea disappeared pretty quickly when I noticed the boat had stopped moving. The wind was still pushing across the lake, and the water was still shifting beneath me, but the boat wasn't drifting anymore. It was sitting in exactly the same spot. I leaned over the side and looked down. Bigfoot wasn't climbing into the boat. It was holding the entire thing in place. I don't know how long Bigfoot held the boat there. It probably wasn't very long, but when you're sitting in a dead boat watching something like that, grip the side of it, time starts feeling a little different. I stayed where I was and watched it, mostly because I wasn't sure what else to do. The engine was dead. The boat wasn't moving. Bigfoot had both hands on the hull and seemed perfectly content to keep it that way. Then it shifted its grip. At first, I thought it was letting go. Instead, it pushed down on the side of the boat. The hull dropped hard toward the water, and everything on deck immediately slid in that direction. I grabbed for the nearest seat and managed to catch myself for a second, but the boat kept leaning. Before I could recover my footing, Bigfoot pushed again. That was enough. My feet came out from under me, and I slammed into the side of the boat. A second later, I was going over it. The water hit a lot harder than I expected. One moment, I was in the boat, and the next, I was completely underwater. I swallowed a mouthful of lake water, lost track of which way was up, and spent a few seconds flailing around before instinct finally took over. I kicked for the surface as hard as I could. When my head broke above the water again, the first thing I realized was that I wasn't in the boat anymore. I was in the lake. The first thing I did was look for the boat. That probably sounds obvious, but when you unexpectedly go into the water, your brain narrows down pretty quickly to whatever seems most important. At that moment, the boat was the only thing I cared about. It wasn't far away. I'd gone over the side, not flown across the lake. A few good strokes, and I probably could have reached it. Then I saw where Bigfoot was. It was still beside the boat. For a second, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was looking at while treading water. Everything had happened so fast that my brain was still catching up. 1 minute, I was in the boat trying to restart the engine. The next, I was floating in the water, looking at the thing that had put me there. What really got my attention wasn't that Bigfoot was close. It was where it had positioned itself. The boat was directly behind it. There wasn't any other way to look at it. If I wanted to get back aboard, I had to go through the same stretch of water Bigfoot was occupying. The closer I looked, the harder it became to convince myself that it was an accident. Bigfoot wasn't splashing around or acting aggressive. It wasn't making noise. It was just sitting there between me and the boat, watching me. I've had some bad days on the water before. Boats break, the weather turns, people fall overboard. None of those situations involved a Bigfoot standing between me and the only thing keeping me out of the lake. And at that moment, I honestly couldn't think of a worse place to be. I kept my eyes on Bigfoot and tried not to think too much about how exposed I was. The boat was right there, close enough that I could have reached it pretty quickly under normal circumstances. The problem was that nothing about that morning had been normal for a long time. Bigfoot hadn't moved. It stayed between me and the boat, watching me while I treaded water a short distance away. Every few seconds, I'd glance toward the hull and then back at it, trying to figure out whether making a run for the boat was a brave decision or an incredibly stupid one. Then a sound came from the shoreline. I've spent most of my life outdoors, and I've heard plenty of animal sounds. This one sounded different. There was an urgency to it. It wasn't especially loud, but it carried across the water clearly enough that I heard it and immediately looked toward shore. So did Bigfoot. The reaction was instant. Its head turned toward the trees and stayed there. For the first time since I'd spotted it crossing the lake, its attention was completely somewhere else. Whatever had made that sound mattered more than I did. I didn't know what I was hearing. I didn't know what had suddenly pulled its focus away from me. What I did know was that Bigfoot was no longer looking in my direction. After everything that had happened that morning, I wasn't about to waste an opportunity like that. The second its attention shifted, I started swimming for the boat. I didn't waste any time wondering what had made that sound on shore. The only thing that mattered was that Bigfoot wasn't looking at me anymore. I swam for the boat as hard as I could. The distance wasn't far, but everything feels farther when you're in the water and trying to beat something's attention back to you. I kept expecting Bigfoot to turn around. Every few strokes I'd catch myself thinking about it and immediately force myself to focus on the boat instead. By the time I reached it, I was completely out of breath. Getting back aboard wasn't pretty. I grabbed the side of the hull, kicked until I got enough leverage, and hauled myself over the edge. I landed hard on the deck, rolled onto my hands and knees, and went straight for the ignition. The engine still wasn't cooperating. The first attempt got nothing. My stomach dropped. I tried again and got a sputter out of it, but not much else. For a second, I thought I was about to spend the rest of my day explaining to a tow truck driver why I needed a pickup from a lake occupied by Bigfoot. Then the engine caught. I pushed the throttle forward immediately, and the boat surged ahead. Water started opening up between me and the shoreline, and for the first time since this started, I felt like I might actually get away. I kept the throttle down and pointed the boat away from shore. At that point, I wasn't worried about my gear, the fish, or even the camera. I just wanted as much distance between myself and that section of shoreline as I could get. For a while, I kept my eyes forward. Then I looked back. Part of me wanted to make sure Bigfoot wasn't still following me. Part of me wanted to know what had been worth all of that. The chase, the fish, the boat. Getting thrown into the lake. There had to be a reason for it. That's when I saw them. At first, I only noticed the Bigfoot that had spent the morning chasing me. Then movement farther up the shoreline caught my eye. A smaller Bigfoot stepped out from the trees. A second later, I spotted another one farther back. The larger Bigfoot remained closer to the water, while the smaller ones stayed near the tree line. One of them kept looking back toward the woods, and when I followed its gaze, I noticed movement deeper in the brush. Something was moving through the trees toward them. I couldn't tell what it was from that distance, but it was enough to explain the urgency in the call that had pulled Bigfoot's attention away from me. The second I saw them, everything that had happened that morning finally made sense. The fish, the way Bigfoot kept forcing me away from that particular stretch of shoreline, the sound from the trees that pulled its attention away from me. It hadn't been trying to hunt me. It had been trying to keep me away from them. I sat there for a few seconds watching the shoreline get smaller behind me. The farther away I got, the more unbelievable the whole thing felt. When I launched the boat that morning, this wasn't even remotely on the list of things I expected to see. Somehow, I ended up filming a Bigfoot swimming across the lake.